Just to let them know. Senator McCormick, we are just going live.
But he hasn't requested.
Okay, I'll tell Jude to watch out for you, try to come in.
Watch out for you. You haven't tried.
Okay, thanks, bye.
And he hasn't tried yet. Fine, period.
Good morning. Today is Thursday, January 11th, 2024. It's 9:02 a.m. and we're having a slightly late start for our Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee meeting. We have one member of the committee who is ill, so we've had the committee diaspora. We have people calling in remote from different places and taking COVID precautions. With that, though, I'm happy that we can pick up our work on S213, an act relating to the regulation of wetlands, river corridor development, and dam safety. And today we're returning to focus on rivers and floodplains. There's Senator White. Good morning. Senator Watson, Senator McCormick's coming on. We'll see if everyone reconnects. We have to relearn some old habits. With that, happy to turn it over to you, Mr. Evans and Ms. Pfeiffer. You can go in whichever order you like, and the floor is yours. We look forward to learning some more. We had one of your alums in earlier this week with Mike Klein. So, morning, and thanks for coming back.
Thank you so much, Chairman. As you said, my name's Rebecca Pfeiffer. Rob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, quickly, and I'll reintroduce later when it's my turn, but Rob Evans, Rivers Program Manager for ANR DEC, but Rebecca will be starting the show off this morning, so Mike is yours.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Pfeiffer. I'm the State NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for Vermont, and the State Floodplain Manager. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you all. I had hoped we would have been in person, but this still works. I think all these years of Zoom meetings will help make this an easy conversation. And I think just to set it off, I look at this as an opportunity for dialogue back and forth. So I have PowerPoint slides as a presentation, but break in with questions, just go right ahead. I see this more as a conversation in the slides as an opportunity to raise pointed issues to discuss. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and I will share my screen. Let's see. Hopefully this should work. Okay.
And Ms. Pfeiffer, Mr. Evans, I had said this to you before, but fairly often, besides sort of we're looking for education on the basic science, what do we need to learn to understand what's going on in that system, and then I think also we're engaged in problem definition, like what are the challenges related to the ways that we're regulating currently, and then to what degree does S213, either as introduced or as modified based on what we learned in testimony, a strategy or solution to improve the way we manage these waterways, which seem to be increasingly troublesome to Vermonters.
Great, because that's what we're hoping to do for you today. As State Floodplain Manager, a lot of the testimony that's been provided to date, you've heard great remarks on Friday, and on Tuesday you had Mike Klein, our former Rivers Program Manager, and Lauren Oates testify as well. And a lot of the testimony to date has really been surrounding river corridor conversations, moving streams, erosion. So I wanted to give some context for the complementary piece to that, which is inundation flooding. Speak a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program and how that is the main lens that we look at floodplain management as a nation, and also in Vermont. It's kind of the first entry point into the conversations with communities and people around floodplains, flooding. and talk a little bit about our no adverse impact strategies. I know that had come up in testimony on Tuesday, and wanted to try to provide a little bit more clarity and some more information on that. So hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Again, I look at this as a conversation, so just break in with any questions. After I speak a little bit more about inundation flooding and floodplain management, how we work with communities, how it works in the state of Vermont, Rob will come to give, I think, that bigger, broader program overview and speak a little bit more to some of the history. I know that Rob had spoke to the committee about a month ago and gave a little bit of like a high level background, like very high level. So we're looking at this as like an in-depth primer on a lot of these issues, just like you requested, Senator Bray.
Great, thank you.
So, come on, next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, there's a little delay. Hopefully I'm not going to be bouncing around all over the place. So to start, I figured, I know this has been asked in some of the previous testimony around the idea of basic concepts, excuse me, and basic terms. I wanted to make mention, we have two websites that outside of our official state of Vermont websites, like our official program websites, excuse me, that are state of Vermont websites, that are our flood training site and our flood ready website. We have a lot of information on basic concepts and ideas. I'm not going to play this right now, but we do have the short 5-ish minute video that we created to talk. It's mainly of dialogue with community, so it's geared towards community decision makers around the concepts of inundation and erosion hazard flooding, how we plan around them in our municipalities. But it introduces some of those basic terms. And I know you've gotten a lot of this in depth, so if you're like, yeah, we get this, just tell me to move along. But I wanted to point those out as resources for the committee members, for senators to go and access during this conversation. If you are like, I can't remember what that term meant exactly, and it's important for me to remember it. So,
yeah, great. Well, and that's perfect. I was going to say, if you could send things, references that we might look in, if people want to do extra reading, for instance. But it sounds like the websites are what you would most recommend as opposed to, I don't know, a print source or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the websites are geared kind of aiming at that municipal decision maker level. Has some in-depth terms. It doesn't go into like the super duper deep weeds of the National Flood Insurance Program. If you wanted to really get into those weeds, I can definitely share other resources. This is really geared at like municipal planning, how to think about flood hazards in your community. How do we as communities, how do we as a state try to reduce reduce adding new infrastructure in hazardous places, how to reduce the conflict that comes when we put things in our river corridors and floodplains. How do we adapt to what we do have in floodplains and river corridors? And so, again, if you're shooting for that really in-depth in the weeds conversation, I can definitely send more. But this, I think, is a good starting place to look around with flood training, and then our flood ready website, which I think I have links to in my slide notes, which I had sent along. We had sent along, or I can also provide it if I might have a QR code, I think, at the end that can, again, you can reference it later on.
For anyone watching those, the presentations and the links and all that will be on our committee page.
They're there.
Yeah, they're already there.
Whatever she said.
Yeah.
Thank you to Emma and Jude for making that happen. Emma from our team. So this is something else that I had heard come up in question in some of the testimony, and this is not any official definition. This is kind of my brain dump of some of the terms, plus some of the more specific terms. There was kind of questions of what's the difference between a floodplain, riparian areas, wetlands, and then there's these very specific terms that apply to the National Flood Insurance Program. Like they're very specific because they're tied to regulatory standards. So again, this is kind of my brain dump and no official term by any means, but a floodplain is a continuum. It's not one thing. When we look at FEMA maps, we tend to, because it's a static flood shown on a map, think of a floodplain as this thing that FEMA maps. But it's a continuum. We have floods that occur on a very frequent basis, an annual flood. We have floods that may be kind of a 5-year recurrence interval, 10-year recurrence, like every a 1%, 100-year flood is what a lot of people think of. That's a 1% annual chance of flooding. I like to equate that if you had a jar of marbles, you have 99 green marbles and 1 blue marble, what's the chance you pull the blue marble out? And that's your 1% annual chance. Like you could pull that blue marble out 2 times in a row, or it might be 125 times before you pull the blue marble out. It's all chance. But I think that also gives the sense that there's not going to be flooding. It's like you either have no flooding or you have this 100-year flood, but it's a continuum. We can have smaller flood events. We do every year have smaller flood events. They may be not as extensive as the floods we experienced in July and in December or in Irene, but it's a continuum. So a floodplain is this dynamic area of where water from our rivers and streams meet the landscape. And that's what I think of riparian. There's some discussion around what is riparian, and it's this transitional zone. I think of it as kind of like where the land and the water meet. It could be a place where you find lots of wetlands that are supported by that periodic inundation from rivers, or that help to feed rivers through groundwater. And it could be a place where, like you spoke with Mike on Tuesday about meander scars and rivers that move and may leave remnants of an old channel. Like those may be right in those riparian lands. So again, it's that transition zone. A lot of the vegetation is usually adapted to some level of occasional flooding. When you talk to landscape ecologists, there's a very well-known, set of plants and trees that we expect to see in floodplain forests because they've adapted to being periodically inundated, having their roots inundated, and thrive on that, need it to live. So those are very general terms. I'm going to speak a little bit about these very specific terms now that are tied directly to the National Flood Insurance Program. We have the Special Flood Hazard Area. A lot of people call it the SFHA. When people say floodplain, kind of colloquially, I can answer that. Generally say floodplain, they may be thinking of the Special Flood Hazard Area, that FEMA floodplain that's mapped. And this indicates floodplain lands, that 1% annual chance flood. That's based on modeling past flood events. It's not looking forward to future potential increases in flooding. It's looking at the floods we've had in the past and where would we expect inundation based on those floods of the past. The floodway, again, a very specific National Flood Insurance Program term. It's an area that FEMA maps. The National Flood Insurance Program assumes development in the floodplain. Like they assume and have built this program around people developing and filling in floodplains. So a floodway is an area that's reserved to make sure some amount of floodwater can still be conveyed and moved, and that we don't completely fill our floodplains in up to the top of the riverbanks. And I know you've heard testimony as to why that's a really bad idea. Base flood elevation, or BFE, again, it's that height of flood, like height above sea level of what that flood, that 100-year flood will reach. So when we look at FEMA floodplain maps, we'll see these numbers. I live in Franklin County, and in that area, our flood elevations may be around 100 and some, because we're close to Lake Champlain. In Montpelier, up in the mountains, we may see higher numbers, but it's basically a depth of flooding. How high does the water get?
Let's go back to speaker.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
We're having little, now I can't get rid of this.
We're rusty.
Ah,
Don't worry.
I don't,
That's good.
there you go.
Sorry, Mark. So committee members, I can't see you. So if you have questions, please speak up because I can't see anyone's hand to call on folks. That's all.
I can, so.
Okay.
Okay, I will be, this is Becca White. I will be loud if I have a question. This is great so far, though. I feel like we need a printout of this for flashcards.
Yeah, I'll get
I
a
know, I-
printout for you.
I was like, here's your like quick reference guide. And then the last piece is flood fringe. I spoke about the floodway, that area that FEMA reserves to make sure water still can convey in a filled-in floodplain. And that flood fringe is what's the part of the floodplain that FEMA is allowing under their minimum standards to be filled in with new construction, fill, and other encroachments. This is kind of a visual of that floodway, flood fringe as it's mapped by FEMA. That flood fringe is that outer part of the floodplain, and then the floodway is that right of way that FEMA reserves. And then the whole thing is, sorry, there's a delay.
Ms. Pfeiffer, is it FEMA that characterizes streams or as, well, floods, as, well, this is a once in 100-year flood, or that was a once in 500-year flood? And I know that, I get the whole probability thing. You could pull the green marble 5 times in a row, even though that seems super unlikely. But I remember reading about in Mississippi that we had something like 8 500-year floods in 12 years or something, so. Are they
You're right.
changing these numbers to reflect the impacts of the changing climate?
The maps do not. So about the likelihood of picking kind of that marble out of the jar twice in a row. In Ripton in 2008, they had 200-year plus events in 1 year. It's all chance. But I think just to your point is that because FEMA doesn't consider how climate change and how water precipitation is changing, the patterns of water and precipitation are changing across the United States, we're only looking at what happened in the past. We're not looking to what's happening in the future and what to expect. And there's a lot of variability and uncertainty, but there are general trends that we do expect to see. And I'm gonna go through quick. I kind of cheat this up as I don't think I need to go into too much depth and detail on this. You've heard previous testimony, and if you've seen any of the testimony from our state climatologist, Dr. Dipini Giroux, this is a little bit older now, but I think it speaks to just in the northeastern United States, we're expecting to see more precipitation falling in those like yearly big rain events. This is through 2012, so a little bit outdated at this time, but this came from our National Climate Assessment, a previous version. I think Dr. Dipini Giroux had been the primary author of the most recent National Climate Assessment for the northeastern US. And the other kind of going in hand with that, it's not just storms are getting bigger, but overall we're seeing more precipitation, again, from a previous climate assessment through 2012, but we see in the northeastern United States, we're seeing larger changes in the amount of precipitation in the northeastern US. Yes, Senator White.
Technically, I think the chair has to call on me.
Oh,
Sarah White, please, any committee member, please jump in because I can't see you.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Rebecca. So something that's come up quite a bit for me with constituents is they're comparing, like I've just had so many people say, wow, it feels just like when I'm in Washington or when I'm in Oregon. Now, when I'm in Vermont, like that our weather pattern is started to replicate what they're seeing in other parts of the country or even in other climates. Is there a comparable climate that we're going to be like, that we should be trying to think about and compare our strategies to theirs? Or are we just in a totally, I'm just thinking, it's just shocked me how many people have made that comment, but even looking at the maps you've shown us, we seem to be getting heavier precipitation than even those places that I've had referenced to me.
I am definitely not the best person to answer that question. I think that someone else who is more involved in the science around climate and our changing climate would be better, like Dr. Dipini Giroux. I think just thoughts on your comment. Part of it could be, Mike spoke quite a bit about moving streams, and moving streams move because of more power energized systems, straightened rivers that are confined in their river channels. But we're also seeing more water, and that can be a contribution. In the Pacific Northwest that you referenced, they have very dynamic streams that are often braided and carry lots of sediment because they have melting glaciers. And so it could be that some of those principles and practices that they've witnessed and seen are more at play here because we have similar types of landscapes. We have steep mountains, lots of water. In our flood events, we don't have glaciers, but we do have steep mountains. And when you have lots of rainfall, and when you compare that to those kind of wildlands in the Pacific Northwest, lots of water moving, lots of sediment, and changing that river system. So that may be part of why it feels similar, because we're seeing some of the same principles and practices playing out from a river science perspective. Not to go too far down this road, and Mike, I think, spoke a little bit to it. When the state of Vermont, when Mike was Rivers Program Manager, when we developed our river corridor science, our river corridors based on the current science, similar types of efforts were being made in Washington State, mapping moving streams, because I recognize most of our flood damages are from those streams moving and not as much from inundation. Like when we think of inundation, we think of the Mississippi River, big, huge, broad, flat areas that fill up like a bathtub. But in Vermont and in other places with steep mountains, where most of our flood damages come from the type of flooding, that's going to create erosion. It's power that's moving and will do work. It'll move sediment, it'll wash out roads, it's going to move boulders, debris, and move around because it's such an energized system. But it's not to say that in Vermont, because we focus so much on erosion hazards, because it tends to be our primary type of flood damage, it's not to say that we don't have inundation flooding. As we saw in the July 2023 floods, Irene was really a story of flash flooding, erosion damage. But I feel like the floods of July 2023, parts of the state, it was definitely still that same experience. But I think a lot of the impacts that people are thinking of in the 2023 floods was that inundation flooding. And I think someone had asked in a previous session about, the way that the water is delivered. Doesn't matter if it's a hurricane or just rain or anything like that.
Yes, that was my question, in fact.
And I think Mike, I think, spoke to it to the effect of like, well, it doesn't matter what we name it. It's all a lot of water. But I think part of the unpredictability of what we don't know from climate change, and people who know better may correct me, but I think we may still see those really big rainstorms with lots of rain falling very quickly, energizing a system, resulting in the type of flood damage like you see on the right hand side of your screen. But we may also see more events. We might start to see, more flood events that are more impacting inundation floodplains, because you just get rain and rain and rain. Everything saturates. There's nowhere else for the water to go. And so we might start to see a greater variety of the type of flood damages than we have in the past.
Thank you for answering that question.
I'm like, others may have more data or more thoughts on that, but that I think we might start to see more variety because of that. We're just going to see more rain, and it's going to be unpredictable in how we may see that delivered. Mike showed this graphic that's on the left-hand side to you on Tuesday, that idea of how floodplains move and adjust.
Yes.
How rivers move and adjust. It is a response to
people on the link,
land use and land alterations. So I think Jude is helping to sort out the screen. I see Senator McCormick is in the room, so I'm going to admit him.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Oh,
No,
it's up there, but
went away.
I don't know.
Maybe he was
Can
admitted.
show everyone and also the presentation.
Okay, all right, so.
And is it?
So
Do you mind muting in the main room?
The other big presentation.
Yeah.
It's okay.
yeah, and why don't you Yeah.
Sorry, we're having a screen adjustment again.
Audio speaker, right?
Yeah.
I'll wait.
Thanks, Rebecca.
All,
We're having fun this morning.
yeah,
We're just on the fly.
all set
Okay.
again.
So that's good. to
So
know.
what you could do, sorry,
Yeah.
you could join the meeting and be muted. And then you could see on your screen, if you have a machine, who's in the meeting and see what she's sharing.
Yeah.
there.
Okay, thank you.
Two machines, got it.
Yeah,
All right, thank you.
It's just.
or we could install another screen here, I don't know if you
All
want.
right,
No, thanks. Okay.
we're good to go again, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
And Senator McCormick has joined us as well.
Great.
How did he get in?
Who knows?
Rebecca let him in.
No, you know what? I gotta say, I don't know. The instructions were so uninstructive that I really did just sort of trial and error. And I
Okay.
really could
All
not
right, but
tell
in
you
the
how I did.
future, I should be letting people in because I don't know who they are.
Yeah. All right, so thank you everyone for your flexibility. Back to you, Ms. Pfeiffer.
Thank you. And hello, Senator McCormick. Just
Hi.
for your knowledge, my name is Rebecca Pfeiffer. I'm the State National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator and the State Floodplain Manager at DEC. And we were just going over some basic terms, some basic discussions. I had mentioned to the other senators that a lot of the testimony you've heard on S213 around rivers has been focused on river corridors and river erosion. So trying to give a little bit of the complementary side of that picture, speaking a little bit more about inundation floodplains and how we look at floodplain management in Vermont.
Yep.
So here on the screen, I mentioned the image on the left is something that you had seen from Mike Klein on Tuesday, the idea of how rivers evolve and change in response to watershed input. So if you have the river's always trying to maintain a stable slope. And so it's going to move and adjust in order to do that. If the water is contained in the river channel because we've bermed, filled, or developed in our floodplains, the water's not able to slow down, then it's going to move faster. It's going to do more work. It's going to widen and start to cut down those banks. And eventually it's going to start to form a new floodplain at a lower elevation. Again, that river is trying to balance the water and water, sediment, and debris within that system. And so that
Rebecca, can I interrupt you? Sorry, I have a question. I asked this before, I'm gonna ask it again. Do you happen to know what that H is greater than HC stands for?
No, you asked that question. I think it is, I'm not certain, I'm not, maybe Rob may know. I think it's about bank versus the height of the channel and versus the height of the floodplain, but I am not certain. And we can follow up on that.
Okay,
I think it's
cool,
kind of
thank
like,
you.
I think that's what it is, but it's been a long time. We've used
Sure.
the image for so long, and you're like, and I've forgotten exactly what it is, but
That's okay. I figured I would ask. Thank you so much.
Rob may know, and so I'll give
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to add, kind of thinking back to college is and the notation on certain parameters. I think that C relates to critical. So it's probably critical height. But I'd have to think through it further in terms of how it's trying to explain that. So I'm kind of like Mike and Rebecca in that regard. It's like I need to go back to school.
Okay, no worries. Thank
Yep.
you.
Yeah, I think it's speaking to instability. Once you said that, I was like, that's what it is. I think it's the instability of the channel. If the height of the banks are higher than the critical height for that slope, that it indicates that it's going to widen. I think. That's
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure. So I bring up, this is an image of the Richmond Park and Ride the day after Irene, driving by from the interstate. And you can see that inundation floodplain is the area that river is going to access when it's able to access its floodplain. It's slowing that water down. It's storing it so it doesn't go further downstream. And again, it's that river trying to maintain its slope. The function, there we go. The function of our floodplains, we've spoken about this before. They're very, they're some of the most diverse, biodiverse areas in the world, because it's that interface between that moving river water and the upland areas. It's kind of this interface of where water meets the land. And so they're critical places for fish and wildlife habitat, for bugs and critters, for vegetation, but it's also an area that helps to slow water down. It allows sediment to fall out of that floodwater, so it's not going downstream to Lake Champlain or the Connecticut River or whatever type of receiving body it might be going to. Traditionally, that flood sediment had recharged a lot of our agricultural lands, which is why many agricultural lands historically had been so productive, is because of that periodic inundation from the river replenishing nutrients. Nowadays, floodwater isn't always quite so replenishing in the other things that come along with it, but it helps reduce that flashiness. It slows the peak. Someone had brought up the example of the huge wetland complexes along the Otter Creek between Rutland and Middlebury, and how that slowed and almost halved the peak of the amount of water between Rutland and Middlebury during Irene. So we see that in practice, not just in theory. When we speak about development susceptible to flooding, a lot of times people are always thinking about elevating. That's the language of the National Flood Insurance Program, is that we need to elevate homes and buildings and infrastructure, build it higher, flood-proofing critical infrastructure. That's the general practice that we see, and I'll speak a little bit more about it in the National Flood Insurance Program. But it still means that we have our towns and village centers susceptible to flooding. It doesn't mean that it's safe. It just means that we'll have less property damage if we elevate or flood-proof our buildings. But it is the method that we help to reduce flood losses. But we still need to be aware that it means that buildings will be underwater and that there'll be impacts from buildings being flooded. And I think, the comment and the conversation around climate change is that may lead to deeper floodings, more frequent flooding, and it may be beyond what we've seen on FEMA maps. So I've alluded to and spoken quite a bit about the National Flood Insurance Program, and this is a national program and has been the primary way that we frame and speak about floodplain management in the country and traditionally in Vermont. The National Flood Insurance Program is kind of made up of 4 parts, 4 pieces. Excuse me. Excuse me. The Federal Flood Insurance Program was created in 1968. And it was really a response. Most private flood insurance had left the market because they couldn't make money. The only people who bought flood insurance were people who frequently flooded, and then they would be paying out so many losses. And that people who may be susceptible to flooding but less frequent flooding wouldn't buy flood insurance because of the cost of it. And so private insurance had pretty much wholesale left that insurance market, and people had no recourse. And so in the 60s, enacting the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968, they created this framework to be able to provide flood insurance to people who lived and had buildings in the floodplain. The idea originally, when the program was created, was that once we identify floodplains, and once people are flooded and understand that risk, no one's going to build in the floodplain anymore. So over time, we'll buy out our risk, and we'll eventually, reduce development in floodplains. That was kind of the idea at the beginning of the program. But so it's a voluntary program, and it's kind of almost like a feedback loop, a feedback cycle. So FEMA creates flood hazard maps. They map inundation floodplains and basically offer the ability for people and communities to buy flood insurance in communities where the community agrees that they will manage and regulate the development that occurs within those mapped flood hazard areas. So community voluntarily agrees to join the program, and they commit to issuing flood hazard permits, enforcing those regulations, making sure buildings meet a minimum standard. And in exchange for that, FEMA makes flood insurance available to any resident in the town, regardless of whether or not they're in that map floodplain. And they also make flood hazard mitigation grants available to help buy down and reduce risk.
Ms. Pfeiffer, when, so a flood hazard area is not synonymous with a floodplain? Is it, do they vary, and if so, how?
Great question. So FEMA, FEMA has very specific terms because it's tied to a regulatory program. It's tied to regulations, it's tied to insurance. So when we speak about the 100-year flood or the special flood hazard area, it's very specifically referring to that the floodplain that FEMA has mapped. But floodplain, and so a lot of people say floodplain offhand, and a lot of times in their mind, they're thinking of that FEMA floodplain on the flood maps. But a floodplain is really a continuous ecosystem. It's a continuous area that you could have a floodplain that floods every year. You could have a floodplain that floods more frequently than those FEMA floods, but but not every year, every 10 years, And so a floodplain is kind of this generic term of where water meets land, where when there's too much water in the river system, it's going to spill out into that floodplain area. And so it's a generic term, but a lot of people, I think, when they say it, they are picturing those FEMA maps in their head. But a floodplain could be a 2-year floodplain. It could be like a recurrence interval of every 10 years. It could be 50-year floodplains. It's a continuum. So you could have someone in FEMA's mapped floodplain, that 100-year floodplain, 1% annual chance floodplain. And you could have someone at the very edge of it who may have a very low chance of flooding from any given year. And you could have someone who's almost right next to the channel. They're both in that floodplain, but that the person who's right next to that river channel may be flooded every 2 or 3 years, every 5 years. And that person on the very edge of that map floodplain may see flooding much less frequently. And so it's kind of like the terms intermingle a lot. When I speak generally to people, I may say floodplain offhand, but when I'm speaking to towns or when I'm speaking to someone who's looking to do any sort of development or a project in and around floodplains, I very specifically use special flood hazard area or SFHA to indicate like this is a regulatory term.
Okay, and what's the frequency of flooding threshold that puts you into the special hazard area? Is it once in 100 years? That's how broad the area is defined.
It is. That's what they chose when they created the program. They chose that 1% annual chance recurrence interval, 100-year flood. A lot of people use. Sometimes it's a misnomer because people think, oh, well, I flooded once, I'm not going to flood again for 100 years. But that's not the case. We spoke before about chance. Again, you could have someone in that 100-year floodplain that floods every 2 or 3 years. But it was basically a compromise. Some places, some countries may map and regulate 500-year floodplains or 1,000-year floodplains. And so I guess when that conversation was happening at the national level, they looked at the 100-year floodplain as a compromise, something that is a rare event that people may not be aware that they may have risk. It may not take action to protect themselves, vis-a-vis flood insurance or elevation or mitigation, but it's also not, it's something that is likely to still happen in someone's lifetime. Like, oh, I remember that area over there flooding. So it wasn't so rare an event that it was overly protective, I guess, in their opinion at the time they created the program.
And with fluvial erosion flooding events, do they generally occur within that special hazard area? It's not so much that they're spreading out broadly, but they're highly destructive in an area that's already mapped, but trying to understand how a regulator looks at the fluvial erosion events compared to the inundation events.
I'm going to speak a little bit more about that a little later in my presentation. Sure. I know Rob is going to speak to it quite a bit more and go through some scenarios. So if it's okay, do you mind if we we'll
No,
bring it
no.
back up again.
Yeah, of course. Happy to wait. Thank you.
I'm gonna make a note to make sure we do specifically address your question though. Okay. So, as I mentioned about the National Flood Insurance Program, it's aimed at communities. So it's an agreement between the community, the individual community, and FEMA. The community applies to join the program to FEMA. You know, they apply to FEMA to join the program. So those communities have to adopt flood regulations. They have to implement them, meaning issuing permits and reviewing development to meet at least the minimum standards that FEMA has put forward. And they have to enforce them. So when things go in that don't meet their requirements or things that go in without permits or review, they need to enforce them, just like you would other zoning. And so in Vermont, zoning and land use decisions generally go town by town. We don't have county government in New England like the rest of the country. So most land use decisions start at the community. And as I'm sure many of you can picture, in all of your across the state of Vermont, there's many towns that do not have zoning. But they may, because if they have flood hazard regulations and they've joined the National Flood Insurance Program, they're regulating development in those floodplains. So you can imagine what a challenge it can be for those towns. They don't have any sort of zoning infrastructure already built and set up. They don't have someone, to review. They don't have a permit process. They don't have enforcement provision. They're having to create all this from scratch. And so we work very closely with the regional planning commissions to support the towns in doing this work. But it is a real big challenge for many communities in Vermont, and it's a really big lift. There's some towns that have very consciously decided not to enact zoning regulations, but still join the flood insurance program and regulate development in their floodplains because citizens in their town need to be able to access flood insurance. So again, in most cases, many private citizens can access flood insurance unless the town's in the National Flood Insurance Program. Some of that's changed a little bit in recent years. I don't want to get into that too much, but I can if you have questions.
Sorry, does it sound about right? I thought I heard it maybe the other day that someone said only 10% of towns have adopted, implemented, and enforced flood hazard area regulations in a way that qualifies them for NFI.
Not quite for NFIP. I will get to that in just a slide or two and speak a little bit about how that breaks down across Vermont. One of the things I failed to mention on the previous slide is that the reason why towns join, so you might think like, why would a town join the program if they don't want to get into the business of zoning? People who have homes or buildings or structures in FEMA's map flood hazard area are required to have flood insurance on the building if they have any sort of federally backed loan or mortgage. So that's the hook. When they first started the program, they figured everyone would want to be able to access flood insurance, but then no town signed up for the program. And then 2 years later, Congress said that, okay, well, if we're backing your loan, through an FDIC insured bank, bank loan or some sort of federal loan or mortgage, people who are in these map floodplains are required to have flood insurance to protect the investment. And that was the hook. And then many towns at that point joined the program. So in Vermont, a lot of our communities joined the National Flood Insurance Program around the mid-70s, early mid-70s or so. But again, that local administration of regulations is usually the biggest barrier for why towns may not be in the program. This is a little bit about our role in floodplain management. And you might be thinking, well, if FEMA and the towns are the ones that make the agreement for regulating floodplains, what is the state, like what's the state's role in all this? What is the state doing? Our primary role, training, outreach, and education. FEMA has a yearly grant that they pay us to help provide support and technical assistance to towns, and also to help them ensure that there's compliance to some level within the towns. The state of Vermont, we're somewhat unique from the rest of the country in that we have a state statute, 24 VSA 4424, that requires us to review the local floodplain management development projects before the town issues a permit. So we're in some ways acting as a technical assistance, kind of like step-by-step technical assistance for those towns. We also support municipalities by providing model flood regulations for them to consider and helping to ensure what they do adopt does at least meet minimum FEMA standards, although we have model regulations looking to try to meet a much higher standard, which we'll talk about. And we provide post-flood permitting and damage assessment assistance. Two newer things, or relatively newer roles of our program, is that we provide technical support for Act 250. We review projects under our procedures about whether or not development or the proposal meets the criterion 1D standards for Act 250, but that's our recommendations to the district commissions, which they can then choose to do with what they will. And in the aftermath of Irene, the legislature gave us the authority for issuing flood hazard area river corridor permits. So it's a very limited set of development that we review where we're actually issuing permits. It's things municipalities can't regulate. So we're doing this for compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. That includes state facilities, agriculture, power transmission, and power generation. And I see a question.
Chair Bray, I just had a quick question.
Please.
Thank you, Rebecca. So one of the concerns we heard raised in another committee in government operations was towns who post flooding and, you know, then any future flooding, they would have this need as well, but they're just not able to find engineers. They're not able to find folks who can give them real science-based information on how to move forward post-flood. Do you maintain a list, or I'm not saying that necessarily you should be offering that level of technical support, although that's a bigger conversation, but do you maintain a list or offer guidance on who municipalities should work with when they're considering how to scientifically respond and make those decisions after a flood?
Thank you. We do not maintain a list. Part of it is because floodplain management expertise varies depending on what level someone may need. If you're talking about like wastewater treatment facilities, that's a very specific and in-depth. You need engineering firms who have in-depth knowledge about wastewater treatment facilities, but also having some course like having some sort of connection to understanding the National Flood Insurance Program standards and regulations. There's a lot of engineering firms in the state who have some experience with flood insurance standards. And I'm going to speak to some of this in just a minute. So there's a few different barriers to why it's so difficult for kind of general knowledge of how to respond, because, and the main thing is that I mentioned every town joins the flood insurance program. Every town has a different set of regulations. And so when we go, and this will kind of be preempting some here, I'll jump to my next slide. This is a map of all the towns in the state of Vermont that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. We have 274 communities because FEMA may count towns, cities, and incorporated villages as separate communities for the flood insurance program. And we have 20 communities that do not participate. So every one of these towns has a separate set of regulations. They may rhyme a little bit within specific regions because the regional planning commissions typically are the biggest assistant in trying to help the towns to adopt flood regulations when we work with the regional planning commissions and the communities. So kind of in different regions, they may have very similar sounding standards, but our first interaction with every town, every project, every engineer is to say, let's open up your regulations and see what you require, because everyone is different. And it could range, this is to Senator Bray's question from before about only 10% of towns have flood hazard regulations. So we have 274 communities. It's like 92% of communities that at least meet FEMA's minimum flood standards. The comment you made of 10% of towns, that's for towns that meet a higher standard that's equivalent or approaching our state no adverse impact standard that we use through our flood hazard area river corridor rule and through our Act 250 procedures and our model regulations we suggest to towns. So in my next slide, I show just that distribution of towns. So you see here towns that are yellow are towns that do have river corridor protections to some extent. Most of them are meeting our state standard for river corridor protections. And then the ones that are orange may have a mix of partial river corridor protections, or they may have a higher inundation flood hazard standard that may limit new development or fill within their floodplains. So that's a mix. So that's the 10% that you were asking about, Senator Bragg. It's that 10% of towns, I think, that have river corridor protective flood hazard regulations.
And that is a standard, so that's the NFIP minimum plus additional regulation as model, like by the I shouldn't say model, is required by the state, like you have specs and someone has to fulfill those on top of the NFIP.
Yeah, so these are towns that exceed the minimum standards of the National Flood Insurance Program. What for many years we had created model flood regulations with our recommendations for better flood hazard protection, protecting people, protecting that floodplain, minimizing the use of fill, minimizing new structures going into hazard areas, because we're trying to not make it worse. You know, we're trying to first we have to stop adding, you know, new risk and trying to then buy down the risks that exist. So these are towns that may meet our river corridor standards that we use through our FARC rule or the recommendations we make in Act 250 or in those model regulations. And all three of those are essentially the same standard, just kind of delivered in a different format, either through our rule and rulemaking, either through our procedures and how we review Act 250 projects, or the model recommendations that we make to towns for their adoption. But ultimately, if the town is at least meeting FEMA's minimum regulations, they can join the flood insurance program, they can adopt those standards. And so we have a huge range of what towns have. Many of our communities have at least some minimally higher than FEMA minimum standards. It may be requiring a little extra freeboard, like someone has to elevate a little higher. But we have a range from people who may, I just saw I forgot to plug my computer in. So we may have some towns that allow for fill and new structures to go into the floodplain, you know, just meeting FEMA's flood hazard, just meeting the minimum flood hazard, the base flood elevation with no extra elevation. And then we have some towns that may limit or prohibit new structures or new fill. They regulate river corridors. So it's a really wide range. And again, like that first entry into every single conversation with our towns is, okay, let's open up your regulations and see what we have. If you
is there other than trying to be, you know, managing your town better, are there consequences of meeting the higher state standards? Like, do they become eligible for state monies that they would not otherwise be eligible for instance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the towns on the previous slide are communities that are eligible for additional state funding under our Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, ERAF. So this is a rule where towns that take greater mitigation actions before flooding are eligible to receive additional funding from the state post-flood. So after we have a federally declared disaster, like for example, the July 2023 floods, FEMA typically cost shares the cost to repair public infrastructure, roads, bridges, could be public buildings as well. Typically, that cost share is 75% paid by FEMA, 25% paid by towns. In really large flood events, 2023, I'm pretty certain, I know after Irene, the cost share may be greater if FEMA's paying 90%, the towns are paying 10. That's because there's so much more damage to pay for. So in that local cost share, towns that have taken greater mitigation steps, the state kicks in a portion of that cost share. So if a town is responsible for 25% of the total costs, a community that has taken several steps, they're having a local emergency operation plan up to date, having a valid hazard mitigation plan, having adopted VTrans's road and bridge standards, and communities that have adopted river corridors or these higher floodplain standards are eligible for the state to be paying 70% of their local match. So
Uh-huh.
that is an incentive program. When Mike Klein was program manager, Barry Cahoon before him, they had really worked hard to create a strong set of incentives, with other state agencies and other state programs to create the suite of incentives to really help support towns to take these, what can be sometimes harder mitigation actions.
Okay.
Limiting development in your river corridor, limiting development in your floodplain.
On this map we're looking at now, the yellow towns are eligible for this higher level of support. How about what does interim river corridor protection mean?
That's diving down into the weeds. You can tell me we don't need to go any further or say keep going. When we created the ERAF rule was updated 2000 and Robbie, 12. I'm like 2008, 2010, 12. It's been a long time. In 2012, the ERAF rule was updated and created this higher kind of tiering system. At the time, we had towns that maybe had not adopted full river corridor protections, but had been some of our first towns to adopt. At the time, we called them fluvial erosion hazard areas. So they didn't have it for their entire community. They may have only had it for a portion of their rivers, or we had towns that in the absence of flood hazard area FEHs, fluvial erosion hazard areas, FEH. At the time, we were still doing them kind of town by town as requested. We may have had towns that took a bold step in really limiting development in their inundation floodplain. And so those interim towns are those we wanted to acknowledge that some of these leading towns taking really hard steps and allowing them to gain that benefit. And then we had a kind of a transition to when we would have the towns having to meet that higher ERAF standard by having full river corridor protections. So I'm like, that's way in the weeds, and I can provide more information for the committee on that if you'd like to learn more about ERAF. We have plenty of slides, but I didn't include them in the slide deck about ERAF.
Yeah, I don't want to take too long on this, but is it right or wrong to think of the orange towns as working on getting to being yellow towns?
Yes, I think that that's a good way to think of it. It's like it may have been that they were the kind of like partial river corridor protections, or they didn't have river corridors drawn at the time. This was before we had statewide river corridor maps. And so they didn't have a river corridor map drawn, but they had adopted very protective inundation flood standards, limiting new fill, limiting new structures. Those are, very hard steps. So we were trying to acknowledge those really hard steps by giving them that benefit. Okay. So kind of working towards river corridors.
Thank you.
So I've alluded to this and spoken to this. I don't want to go too much into the science and detail of floodways, but I can. I'm like, I can talk about this stuff for hours, but I'm sure you probably don't want to hear about this for hours. FEMA's program, I alluded to this earlier, FEMA's entire National Flood Insurance Program, by defining that floodway where development is limited, assume we will fill our floodplains in. we'll fill our floodplains in with fill, we'll fill our floodplains in with new development and new structures. We're going to elevate our buildings to make sure that they're safe from flooding. So this is an image from one of FEMA's training manuals for like local municipal officials who administer the flood insurance program standards. This is like how they teach floodplain management and the National Flood Insurance Program. We spoke, I alluded to this before, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit in our conversation, but 80% of our Vermont towns have higher flood hazard standards, higher than FEMA minimum floodplain standards. But many of those towns may only minimally exceed FEMA's minimum requirements. So they may say, well, you have to elevate an extra foot when you build, or maybe we're going to limit a few things in our floodway. Like you can't have junkyards in our floodway because the floodway is an area that limits new encroachments, but it still allows you to potentially develop if you do an engineering study to show that you're not going to raise flood heights. But FEMA's program is based on the idea that flood heights will go up from loss of floodplain. So when we fill our floodplain in, Mike spoke about this with rivers, the more they're squeezed in, the more unstable they can become. When we lose that floodplain, the water can't be compressed. It can only go faster or it goes higher. And so when we fill our floodplains in and we squeeze that water into smaller areas, it may go higher and it may go faster. And so we know that like FEMA has a base flood elevation that towns regulate to. FEMA's modeling already assumes that flood heights may go up to a foot above the level that towns regulate to. And I see a question, Senator Bray.
Whoever it is, I can't see you. Please jump in. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. This is Dick McCormick. Traditionally, the way we've responded to areas that are vulnerable to flooding is to rip wrap and channelize and basically try to manage it so that the areas don't flood. Are you, if I'm hearing you right, are you saying that what we can also do is simply design for resilience with the expectation that they'll be flooded?
I think that that's a strategy. I think, I think a lot of times these conversations are like all or nothing. And I think Rob Evans, when he had spoke last month, very lightly touched on it, maybe not. We may issue permits with our stream alterations permit to dredge in limited circumstances post-flood. We're going to be issuing permits to armor the banks because we're protecting existing infrastructure. And so it's one tool in one spot, but I think as an overall policy, we want to think about like, what are the continuum of options? So we have downtowns. We have downtowns that are there. We have lots of infrastructure and buildings and houses that are in floodplains. And so we think we've heard quite a bit after Irene. Lauren Oates testified to this on Tuesday. And she spoke about like after Irene, a lot of the kind of post-flood response was to do buyouts, to buy out a home and protect that land and keep new buildings from going in on it. Stephanie Smith, our state hazard mitigation officer, testified yesterday in the House that what they're seeing in this response after the July 2023 floods has been more mixed. So the buyout in a city like Barre of 80 homes is significant. 40 homes is significant. And so I think in this flood, we're seeing a much more mixed response where we're seeing downtown development, possibly looking at how do we harden or elevate or better protect structures to withstand flooding, understanding they may still flood. And where we have opportunities or more open floodplain, maybe those are areas that we look to do buyouts, or we look to, speak with towns about limiting new houses from going in those hazard areas. So I think it's going to be a continuum of options.
Rebecca, go ahead, Senator. Go ahead.
Thanks. What water impervious foundations, keeping appliances out of the basement, that do so that the place can flood, and then the people just move back in rather than having a muddy disaster.
Yeah, I think those are some of the strategies. You could harden a building like a boat. dry flood proofing. That's usually
Yeah.
very expensive and hard to achieve. It's usually something that we only see on like industrial, commercial, critical facilities that we need to maintain functionality. But that flood proofing can be overtopped. We could also, for residential buildings, typically the methods may be to elevate and what's called wet flood proofing, allowing the area beneath the home to flood. So you have a garage maybe on the first floor with flood vents to allow water to come in and flood. We make sure the materials it's constructed out of can withstand flooding. We don't have utilities down there. We only use that space for parking. We don't use it as living space. So then after the flood goes and recedes back, you kind of sweep out the silt and sediment that may have been left and do cleanup, but you're not but you're going to have minimal like reconstruction of your home, loss of personal belongings. You're trying to minimize some of those, but it's still an impact, and it still can be quite traumatic for a lot of people. So it's a balance of where different solutions may be appropriate.
Thank you.
Rebecca, can I just add a little bit of context or additional information on this slide? I just want to be really clear that this, on one hand, the floodway concept, as shown here, it's not saying channelize the river, although that is ultimately what will follow if you build right up to the floodway boundary and fill the flood fringe. What this is really, it's a 1960s compromise, as they were thinking about building out and building up the National Flood Insurance Program, which came online initially in 1968. It was a recognition at that time that they didn't want to limit development floodplains. Economic development should proceed, but we need to reserve some space for the river and for floods to pulse downstream. And so the floodway, and I'll have some maps that I walk through that to put additional context to this. The floodway is that compromise, which is we're going to leave some space for the river where the floodwater's fastest and deepest. But so it can be an effective tool, but it's not a good tool in and of itself. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, so yeah, Mr. Evans, so that's helpful. And when I look at this graphic, it reminds me of Mike Klein talking about, how we channelize and cause instability. It looks like a recipe for instability as opposed to sound river management practices. And I get it's a compromise, even towns want to grow, but we seems like a strategy that lets us shoot ourselves in the foot, especially given the change in precipitation that we're experiencing.
You're spot on, Senator Bray. I mean, he used the Montpelier example, classic example of the encroachment and what needs to follow. And again, back in 1968, the thinking around rivers was different, that we could engineer them and manage them. And that, the understanding of river dynamics and fluvial geomorphology just had not come of age, not even close back then. So the floodway can still be an effective tool. It's one tool in the toolbox, but it's insufficient in and of itself. And again, I'll walk through some map examples later to hopefully put a finer point on that.
All right, thank you.
I had to find my mute button again. One of the other comments I wanted to make before moving on, I'm going to speak a little bit about the flood hazard maps that FEMA creates. I think one of the questions that you posed to us, Senator Bray, and from the committee was, to what are the challenges that we face? And I think I've spoken to this to some extent, is that one of the big challenges that every town has a different flood hazard standard. So the entry into any conversation is, we have to open up your flood regs. What do you have? I think from a state perspective, one of our missions and tasks is to provide education and support and outreach. And I think, it's a hindrance that we're not able to just create standardized forms, standardized training to one set of standards. I think every time we talk and do trainings, we say you have to look at your flood regs. Here's some ideas and things, but you have to look specifically at what your town has adopted, because every town is different. And so one of the things that we are working on is developing a suggested minimum set of floodplain standards for towns for the National Flood Insurance Program that we may suggest as potential to help standardize, create a common starting place. So every town that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, a recommendation would be that they all have a level, the same level, starting at the same level.
Yeah,
I think that could be something that would help to create a lot of efficiencies in training and support. But I think it also, to Senator White's question about like the difficulty for engineering and technical support, I think it may create a better climate for kind of practitioners to understand, like they go into this town, they know roughly where they're starting at. A town maybe adopts higher standards, but that might be less likely if there's higher standards that each town starts at.
sure. The variation town by town in terms of their flood regulations, is that, because if you're starting sort of from scratch and you don't have that much technical knowledge, they end up learning a little more, but it's a unique sort of learning process. Or, so they only get so far in adding to the baseline regulations, or is it that you face a certain level of antipathy to planning to begin with, and so towns are reluctant to add additional regulation, or some combination of those things?
Yeah, a little bit of both, I'd say. Right now, we are, I'm about to, my next portion of my presentation is about the National Flood Insurance Program maps. When FEMA updates flood hazard maps, we as a state help the communities ensure they're meeting the minimum floodplain the minimum FEMA floodplain standards. It's part of their process of new maps coming out. We have to ensure the town is minimally compliant. So right now we're working with regional planning commissions across the state in reviewing local flood hazard regulations. And I think the response is a variety of all those things. Some are towns, the planning commission, we work with the planning commission, the RPCs work with the planning commission, they get it, they're understanding, they really support it. And maybe it goes to the select board and the select board may not be as supportive. They're hearing from the public. Typically in a situation like this, when you're talking about land use zoning, understandably, everyone thinks, well, how does this affect me and my parcel? And so they may be saying, I might be impacted by these regulations. But that's part of why we've tried to create those incentive packages for towns to say, this is a bigger picture of trying to help save the town money, reduce trauma to your residents, trying to help to maintain some level of floodplain functions, and recognizing that climate change is probably only going to make this worse. And so it can be really difficult because a town, all decisions are local, and you have a town select board and you have some residents who may not want to be limited in what they can and can't do in and around a river and a floodplain. And they may really feel that pressure from their citizens and not support it. It could be that they don't really see it as an important thing. I think one of the questions was kind of like who may not be in support of something like S213. And I think some of it is land, like land use proponents, people who want to protect private property rights, and developers who may be looking at large scale development, who may look at floodplain lands, flat river bottom floodplain lands as a great place to build. When you're looking at, mountains and difficult places to build, and you look down in the river valley and you see flat land that's a lot easier to build on. It can sometimes be more attractive to build. So those, I think, are some of the challenges that our towns face. Some of it could be apathy. Some of it could just be like, we don't want to do planning. We don't want to do zoning. And so we're just going to adopt whatever the state tells us, whatever FEMA's minimum may be, and just kind of get it done. And
Right.
so it could be all those things.
Yeah, well, given that the floodplain or the river system is an integrated single entity, it seems as though maybe a helpful state role is to say, you're part of a bigger system. Your choices that may feel entirely local have watershed level implications for people downstream. And I don't know how we build that sensibility, but it seems as though it's a necessary thing, given the challenging climate we're in, that it seems like it's only going to become more challenging.
I 100% agree. And I think that is one of the things that our program spends a lot of time trying to have those conversations. Because we don't have any mechanism to require a town to have to adopt they could join the flood insurance program with a minimally compliant, minimally FEMA compliant set of regulations that may allow filling and new structures and all that. May not look at river corridors. FEMA does not map or look at erosion hazards. I know that Mike had testified to that on Tuesday. And so we try to make a really good argument as to why what we do in one town affects the next town downstream. And why, as a river system, we're trying to look at those protections as a whole. But every town is different. Every town is unique. And so, the issues that they face in each town may be different. The decisions that they make then are going to be dependent upon kind of the local politics, local thoughts and attitudes, local level of attention. As I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate, in some towns, it can be hard to get a planning commission meeting together to have the time to talk about some of these issues. We've had some really small rural towns really tackle this and take this on. They see the importance of it. And we've had some towns that they don't have that, they don't have the time, or they don't have the volunteers to really dig into these complex issues and discussions. Because all local boards are pretty much all volunteers. So
Yeah, we rely on volunteers in Vermont to an extraordinary degree to do a lot of the things. Well, and I suppose, I said in a very polite way, sensibility about your downstream neighbors. Maybe where we really need to be going is to a paradigm that says you have an obligation to your downstream neighbors.
Senator Bright, just quick question here. And thank you for that last point. This is more of a thought, and I don't know necessarily if it would be a conversation for our bill for H213, and some additions to it, or if this is just a conversation that would be had with the administration about an effective way to reach those municipalities. But I'm wondering, in part, if there are municipalities that select out of doing this type of planning because they don't have, or they don't feel that they have a major river or stream flooding repeat issue. Most of the towns that we represent in Windsor County would not be a part of that group. Most of them have a brook or a river or something. But is there a way or a thought process for mapping or strategically picking certain areas of the state where we have these high frequency events and just saying, we're going to invest some very specific money and resources from the state to support these municipalities to get them to do it? Because I do feel that there are towns that don't necessarily equally benefit from this work because they're not seeing these repeat events, or it's not something that they want to use their limited resources on. But then there are areas that we seem to be just peaking with the amount of money that we need to reinvest. So I'm wondering if you, as an administration, or has that been a part of the thought process of working more closely in repeat areas? And should we be working maybe in this bill to think of ways that we can help those areas? I don't know. It's trying to be strategic, knowing that we have limited resource and funds.
I think it's a good point. We have not at this time done that level of analysis. I think one of the challenges to that is that in Vermont we tend to see flooding, but in the past, especially because a lot of damages are erosion damages, it may be really localized. And then we have these big events that tend to be much more broadly impacting lots of areas. So I would say that most places in the state are vulnerable and susceptible to flooding. A lot of places, we have what I'm like looking at Robbie's in the next room over, like 14,000 miles river miles in the state. And I think the mode of flooding may be part of it too, is because you have towns that may be more susceptible to erosion hazards. They tend to be the mountain towns, and not by far not as a rule, but I think as a general trend, more mountainous towns tend to be more rural. They tend to maybe have less less municipal resources for staffing,
Yep.
and having some of those conversations. But we've seen some real uptake because some of those towns have been devastated. Like the town of Montgomery has adopted full river corridor protections because they've seen, they've had those repeated flood events. There's pictures of Senator Sanders back when he was still in state government, in Montgomery in 1998, when the roads just washed out and the Trout River moved across the town. So it's like some of these mountain towns may be experiencing more erosion hazards, and so FEMA programs may not always be FEMA flood regulations may not always be a great fit, because the FEMA flood regulations are looking at inundation, but then they took on adopting and regulating river corridors, seeing that as some of their bigger flood risk. But then we have other towns like the town of Waterbury is definitely a town where inundation it tends to be their bigger risk. They have higher mountain streams, but their big risk is the village, kind of at the confluence of the Winooski River and Thatcher Brook, and have taken steps also to help try to provide better inundation protections. So it's a mix, and we try to really match like the flood risk to the town. We haven't done like a targeted outreach. We've tended to try to more target the kind of appropriate flood regulation conversations to the type of flood hazard we may expect to see in that town that they've experienced.
And what you're saying is, based on the uniqueness of most of our municipalities, that kind of maybe grouping or highlighting specific areas, it might not be beneficial, is what I'm hearing. So your approach has been okay. That makes sense. Darn.
It could be. I think it's, I can't speak for the administration, but it could be something that could be explored to see if there's benefit. We tend to target towns more around mitigation based on the type of flooding that they've had. So like what kind of mitigation strategies. FEMA has programs, mitigation programs that are focused towards targeting where we see repetitive inundation losses. And so I think towns tend to be targeted more on flooding frequency for mitigation from a FEMA standpoint. And we tend to work more with the regional planning commissions at that planning stage to say, let's really look at what kind of flood risk you have in your town. Do you see both inundation and erosion risk? Do you see primarily inundation risk? So like in Burlington, the confluence of the Winooski River with Lake Champlain, we've had some conversations around erosion risk. It's not to say that it may not exist there, but they have small streams that tend to empty right to Lake Champlain. They have a really big river, running through part of the city. So a lot of our conversations with a city like Burlington is around inundation protections. Yeah, so that's how we've tried to approach it, is really having a targeted conversation.
Ms. Pfeiffer, so I wanted to check in time-wise. Is 25 minutes enough time for you to finish your presentation, or what's your sense? I know that I myself have been slowing you down by asking quite a few questions, so but I'm just trying to make sure we have enough time for Mr. Evans after a very brief break, so we don't sit for 3 hours straight.
I don't blame you. Yes, I can do that. Thank you for the time check. And what I'll do is I may kind of go past some slides pretty quickly. A lot of the slides I have coming up are going to be a little bit more of a visual, just to see it. So I mentioned I was going to speak a little bit about the flood hazard maps. One of the things that we spoke about was those FEMA maps that FEMA creates, showing the 100-year floodplain, that 1% annual chance floodplain. I think this was in Mike Klein and Lauren Oates' testimony on Tuesday, there was some conversation around the age of flood maps. In Vermont, the average age of flood maps is about 27 years old, and you can see in some areas of the state, some of those, the average age of the flood maps in that county, in Grand Isle County, 42 years. They've had one flood map created when they joined the program and nothing since, in the kingdom. So the map that I have here of the state, you can see blue and green. In all the counties and towns that are green are places where we still have paper maps as the official FEMA map. Those maps may be 20, 30, 40 years old. And we only have digital floodplain data in those counties that are blue. And at this point right now, a lot of those maps have, the newest maps are in Bennington County that are 8 years old, going on 9 years old now. So those are the newest maps that have been created. But I'll speak to this in just a second. This is some examples. So this is the effective flood map in the town of Franklin. This is what they use to regulate flood hazards. It has a date in 1985, but was probably originally created sometime in the mid-1970s. We have some towns where they have these maps, and this is what they use, again, paper maps. This is in Swanton on Missisquoi. So one of our major rivers with major flooding implications, and these are the official FEMA flood maps. That's all those towns that were green that have those maps for their official maps. And then those towns, those counties and towns that were blue, they have official digital flood maps. This is Waterbury, an example. We have those flood maps available on the National Resources Atlas where they're digital, or this is on the right-hand side is FEMA's Map Service Center where we can view those digital maps as well. But I mentioned a lot of those maps are old, but we're in the process right now of having a statewide update. All of the watersheds in the state are in the process of being updated by FEMA. You can learn more about that process and timelines. If you scan that QR code, it's at that flood training website that we maintain where we talk about this process. And again, this is that entry point of our conversation with essentially every single town that participates in the NFIP in the next several years. We're working with the regional planning commissions to ensure towns have updated their flood hazard bylaws and that they are compliant with FEMA's minimum standards. But we also see it as a great opportunity to have the conversation on the adoption of higher flood standards. But again, this is also an opportunity if we're thinking if there is any thought to an idea of like a minimum statewide floodplain standard for towns that participate in the flood insurance program. This is a great opportunity to integrate those standards at the local level. I see a question.
Please go ahead. I can't see who.
Sure. A question. Do you have a sense of when that process will be done? I mean, I see this headline, right? Get ready for new FEMA maps. Do you have a sense of when they're coming?
So the map on the left shows kind of approximate dates. This was a map created by one of my staff, Ned Swanberg, who's our mapping coordinator. These are kind of approximate deadlines of when we're trying to have our towns having their bylaws updated, their flood hazard bylaws updated by, anticipating FEMA maps going effective about 6 months after that time frame. But the mapping is done by FEMA and their contractors. And so we have seen a lot of slippage in timelines. I've talked to partners in state and local and RPCs, and they're like, you keep telling us your maps are coming, but we haven't heard any announcement of these draft maps. So it's a long process. Draft maps are introduced. It gives an opportunity for communities or individuals to appeal those maps based on updated scientific data. And so that can push timelines back. Sometimes the contractor timeline on the FEMA end slips. And so this is kind of our current approximate timeline for new maps. This is again the deadlines, what we're trying to have our towns be prepared and have their bylaws updated by, anticipating maps going effective approximately 6 months after that time frame.
So does that mean there are no dates, for instance, up there in 24 or 25? But that doesn't mean that there's not work going on in 24 and 25 to get ready for those. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So we're working now, I mentioned we have a grant with the RPCs to where they're helping to do the outreach and work with towns to update bylaws. We're doing that work now with them. FEMA has been in the mapping process for years. So the Missisquoi Basin up in my area, they had kind of the kickoff meetings for those map updates back in like 2018, and it's some of it's there's been reasons for why it's been pushed back, COVID and adding new mapping and things like that. So FEMA, the normal timeline for FEMA in an ideal world is usually several years. They start by a process having a meeting with the town. The contractors have to go out and gather the data, make the maps, do QA, QC, draft maps are introduced, opportunity to appeal. So it's a long drawn out process in an ideal circumstance. And so again, these are maps looking back. They're looking at past flood events. Many of these maps are probably not going to include the July 2023 floods. We've asked the Lamoille Basin is just about to come out with draft maps in the next couple of months, but that won't include the 2023 floods. The floods in the Lamoille Basin, through Hardwick, Wolcott, Johnson, Cambridge, was something akin to what FEMA has mapped as a 500-year flood event, and that won't be included in the consideration of the maps, or at least that's what we've been told.
Yeah, thank you.
As you've heard from Mike, I'll kind of go past this quickly. Many of our Vermont flood risks are not identified on the flood insurance rate maps that FEMA creates. They only map a small portion of the streams. Those new maps will map inundation floodplains down to a 1 square mile watershed, which is by far much more extensive than what we have now. Many of those stream miles are not mapped in a detailed way with flood elevations. They're kind of approximate floodplains. And this is one of the big impetuses of why we started the River Corridor Mapping Program in ANR. So moving beyond the NFIP, I did want to speak to NAI, no adverse impact. I know that had come up in previous sessions or previous testimony. So as a program, when we speak to towns, I mentioned we speak to towns about both inundation flood risk and the ANR River Corridor and erosion hazards. And we see the two pieces as complementary. Both maps together help give a better idea of flood risk. And this is the question you asked earlier, Senator Bray. How, as floodplain managers, when we're reviewing projects or speaking with towns, do we think of it? And I think of it as going hand in hand. So on the screen, you'll see here, the ANR River Corridor is in the yellow. The FEMA inundation floodplain is in red. That floodway that FEMA maps is the cross-hatched area. So this is in Wolcott, off the North Wolcott Road, and you can see some areas where, Mike talked about the Montpelier Gorge and talked about the idea of like these streams that are contained within channel and are transport reaches. They're not able to access floodplain. You see that here towards the bottom of the screen, where the Wild Branch is really contained within channel, but that is usually a signal that the system may be energized and more likely to be erosive and move. And so in those areas, the river corridor may be the bigger protection, an avoidance of adding new encroachments that may result in conflict and the need to armor the channel, and to avoid that kind of sudden avulsion and risk to potential developers or homeowners. And in other parts of this floodplain on the Wild Branch, you see where inundation risk may be the bigger concern. And so we're always looking at like, what is the greater protection? So in the southern part of that reach of the Wild Branch downstream, it may be more avoiding being close to the river channel to avoid the river moving your home or building being undermined. On the upstream section there by the Gulf Road, and the Gulf Road Bridge, it's like the bigger concern is inundation. We want to try to protect, either avoiding using fill to push water elsewhere, elevating any homes or buildings that may be in there, reconsidering, do we want to put a new home that can be inundated? If it does go in, how do we protect the home to reduce the damage during inundation? Okay, I think we've talked about this, the idea of in a river corridor, really an avoidance strategy. In floodplains, there's the ability or opportunity, the conversation about, can we floodproof, can we elevate, minimize risk to the building? In an erosion hazard area, the approach is really avoidance. We've talked about this, the river corridor, I know Mike alluded to this. A stream is dynamic over time. River corridors are providing that space for that process to move out and avoiding having new encroachments or conflicts. So we know the river will move. We're trying to provide the room for that process to play out without having infrastructure and homes in the way of that process. And then over time, that stream is going to be more stable and able to maintain its slope if it has that room to adjust to the water, sediment, and debris in the system. I've spoken how we work with communities to talk about floodplain management. That's our main kind of like way in to talk about this at the local level. This was created by ACCD back post-Irene. They worked with the EPA to come up with a flood resilience checklist for communities. This is around the same time that the state created the flood resilience element in town planning and municipal plan and regional plans. And so I spoke before, it doesn't have to be an either or, it's a continuum of options. So how do we avoid new encroachments and new structures in areas that we can avoid having new development? Where do we plan for new settlements, new growth areas, new housing that we know will not be at risk of flooding, that we're not going to traumatize the people who live in those areas, and the enormous costs of recovery. And then in those downtown villages and downtown cities where we have the river running through it, like Mike talked about the Montpelier Gorge, I love that analogy. I'm going to keep using it. And so in those cases, we have that encroachment. So from a river corridor, the river's not going to regain we've committed to managing it in that straightened reach. And we also think about all the development that occurs there. So are we going to move downtown Montpelier out of the floodplain? No. And so how do we better protect those, historic block buildings, all those downtown businesses, all of those residents? Are there ways to mitigate? How do we work with the State Historic Preservation Office to maintain those historic buildings, but ensure that they still remain 100 years from now? The SHPO's office, Laura Trishman, has been great in working with our program and trying to come up with this, kind of approach to make sure that our historic structures are still here. We want them to remain. We want to acknowledge that they may have different challenges than conventional housing or new housing, but we need to make sure that we protect them, because if not, if they keep flooding, they're not going to be able to remain. So we always promote this idea of an avoidance strategy. Avoidance strategy meets all these goals of climate resilience and adaptation, helping to protect public safety, and ensuring that we maintain and improve, enhance water quality and the ecological integrity of our floodplains and river systems.
One thing that I don't see on that Venn diagram is cost. Maybe it's under public safety, property protection, but affordable housing is a mantra, whatever. We're always looking for developing more affordable housing, and unfortunately, I don't hear very many conversations that say, what are the long-term costs of developing in this area versus the other, because of these incredibly expensive repairs that have to be made if you've built in a floodplain.
100%. And I think one of the things I know, Laura Notes had testified to this on Tuesday, through multiple studies. We worked with the UVM, to create a report around manufactured housing in flood hazards and the type of flood hazards they experience, and which was released about a month before the July, maybe actually 2 or 3 weeks before the July floods. And many of our most vulnerable Vermonters live in river corridors or floodplains. Many of our manufactured housing communities are in floodplains or river corridors. And I think the idea of affordable housing, again, it's like, why would we want to put folks in new housing in places that we know will need some level of recovery, even if we try to create housing that minimizes the cost of damages and the cost of recovery, wet flood proofing, elevation. Are there other ways and strategies that we might be able to increase housing? Because I mean, the July flood showed, where do people go? You know, like when people were flooded out, when people want to do buyouts, they're like, well, where am I going to buy another house? Like, where am I have money for this house, but I can't afford to buy a new house, or I don't have other places to go to. And so I think strategies are going to maybe look different than what we've seen in Vermont before. Maybe it's going to be more density in safer places. Maybe it's going to mean, you know, I think as a state have looked to maintain those compact downtown settlements. And so how do we expand those in ways, you know, maybe it's going up instead of out. You know, these are some of the suggestions and conversations that may be had.
Thank you.
Quick question that is a little bit of an opinion question that I'd like to ask Rebecca. So if you, Rebecca, would like to defer and not answer this opinion question, I'm happy to have that happen. But we had this is very valuable to be in government operations and in natural resources at this moment in time, talking about flood recovery, because the points you're making are so responsive to the exact opposite requests that we're getting from towns. Which is, so I'm wondering if you could respond to a suggestion that was made, and if there's any basis for if we would do it, just logically knowing our rivers. We currently have a buyout program in our state where if you have your property bought out, you cannot, it's my understanding is the FEMA is it's evergreen. You can't rebuild there. Very costly program. I have general concerns, but there was a suggestion that we create a state program with buyouts, but we allow people to rebuild in those locations. My immediate reaction to that was that doesn't seem very smart for us to do that. But do you see any benefit or utility to a program like that from your background? Is there a way to do that?
That is a loaded question. Well, an opportunity for a plug. We do work with Vermont Emergency Management, the state hazard mitigation officer, Stephanie Smith, and her team at administering the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, the FRCF. It was created by the legislature in 2021 using ARPA funding, approximately around $20 million allocation. That has been spent down at this point. That was an incredible program and allowing us to be responsive and very creative in how we use that funding. And so some of the projects that have been funded may be compromises or mixed. Some of it was to do buyouts and relocations within manufactured home parks where there's lots of repeated flooding. We've used it to do some natural resource and floodplain restoration projects. Traditionally and originally it was created with the primary goal or the highest priority goal of home buyouts. I'm always like, never say never. I think generally we don't want to incentivize and rebuild in places that have had repeated flooding. We know it's a floodplain. We know it's a hazard area. Flooding is traumatic. It is very traumatic. I mean, I think Lauren Oates' testimony on Tuesday spoke to that, and you magnify that across the state. We have very vulnerable people living in the hazard areas. However, there may be room to have the conversation. FEMA created the Storm Act, which is basically like a state revolving fund to help fund mitigation. And maybe that's a better way to think of it. It's not so much a buyout and rebuild, but how do we mitigate what's there? So maybe in certain areas we would fund mitigation to create, again, in those like downtown villages where we're not going to fully divest the village. And so it's a mix of responses, and I think to flooding. And so maybe it is hardening, building higher, better flood proofing. But I think I know I've said it 1,000 times this morning, but FEMA maps are looking backwards at past floods. And so I think if we're thinking of a state funded mitigation program, it can be incredibly helpful because we're not playing by FEMA's rules, and we can be really resourceful and creative in how we approach flood management, flood mitigation. And I think it could be an effective way of kind of juggling all those different priorities.
What a diplomatic answer. Well done. Thank you for answering that. And yes, I think there will be some very direct municipal feedback on what we do with any kind of buyout program in the future. And I just am very grateful for your response to that. So you gave me some things to think about.
I know just from experiences working with a regional planning commission who tried to do a home elevation under FEMA's program. I'm like, if anyone from that regional planning commission is watching, they know who they are. And they were they were such an advocate for that homeowner who was trying to do the very best thing and was really stymied by the bureaucracy of FEMA buyout programs and FEMA mitigation programs. And so I really see a state mitigation program as a great way to respond to being creative, being quick, and not taking several years to have these projects go forward too. Because in the meantime, if you're doing a buyout, someone's paying a mortgage on a house they're not living in. And if you're doing a mitigation project, people are sitting there waiting, like, when is the next flood going to happen before this project happens? Or we get stymied by some sort of a FEMA delay or requirement. I think FEMA's investing lots of money in mitigation, and we want to continue to look at the FEMA hazard mitigation programs and hazard mitigation assistance programs as much as we can, and access and leverage those federal funds. But I think there's a place to fill a gap using a state mitigation program.
Thank you.
All right, if you can see if you can wrap us up in the next 8 minutes, that'd be great.
I can do that. I saw Rob brought his screen up, so I wasn't sure if he wanted to add anything, but I'm at the end of my slides. I wanted to touch on that no adverse impact conversation that you had previously, speak a little bit about our rule. And this, I think, really encapsulates the approach that we've taken when we speak with floodplain management to communities, when we look at Act 250 development, when we look at our state rule. So specifically our state rule, the FARC rule, I'm going to probably call it FARC as a shorthand. It's focused on very limited areas of development. We're issuing the permits under our state program. It's state-owned and operated buildings and facilities like the Waterbury State Office Complex with the Tropical Storm Irene high water mark there on the Laundry Building, and bridges and culverts, working with VTrans on our road and transportation infrastructure. It applies to agriculture. Municipalities are not able to regulate agriculture. And so again, this rule is filling the gap of where municipalities are not able to regulate development in floodplains. And lastly, it applies to public power generation and transmission, things going before the PUC. So our no adverse impact standards, excuse me, within our FEMA mapped floodways. I know Mike had spoke, our no adverse impact standard in river corridors is really an avoidance approach, looking at ecology and kind of the need of the river for that movement, trying to limit how much we channelize and armor our rivers. Within our floodplain, we do have standards, I think, that speak to that floodplain function. One of them is in the FEMA floodway. FEMA standard says you can't increase the flood hazard by any amount in this area. That's a FEMA minimum standard. It's a protected area to convey floodwaters, but we've also added that you can't increase velocity. I'd mentioned water can't compress. It either goes higher or goes faster. So a technique people may use to say, well, we're not increasing flood heights in the floodway. We're just going to move it faster. Again, energizing that system, resulting in greater erosion and instability downstream. So we don't allow any increases in flood elevations or velocities. And the no adverse impact standard is really looking at not impacting our neighbors. New development should not adversely impact people and development already in the floodplain, but we also look at it as protecting those floodplain functions as well. No adverse impact to the floodplain and its functions. And then within the entire flood hazard area, we have a no loss of flood storage volume. So any new encroachment or development has to be offset by creating an equal or greater amount of floodplain. And that for structures that are located in the floodplain, either if we do have new structures going in or rebuilt buildings, they have to be elevated at least 2 feet above that FEMA flood regulatory flood height. And we limit critical facilities, requiring them to be protected to the 500-year floodplain and trying to avoid new critical facilities in that floodplain altogether. So kind of like rebuilding what may be there. Like Waterbury had their fire department, it's in the village, and it was located there. It was going to be rebuilt. So that one, at the local level, they required it to be protected to the 500-year floodplain. And after Irene, the flood vents opened and it flooded. So they were out of service during that time. We're trying to avoid that loss of service. But however, after Irene and the water, after Irene passed through, the water went down. They have pictures of them kind of like sweeping out the bays, and they were up and running because the building was designed to be flooded and withstand that flooding. So a quick kind of a visual. I know folks had said that they're very visual learners. This is not quite how comm storage works, but I think from a visual standpoint, it's helpful. So compensatory storage, we may allow for some amount of fill below the flood elevation to elevate a road or a bridge, maybe part of a structures in the flood hazard area. It's an addition to an existing building in the flood hazard area. Some amount of fill is placed. We lose flood storage. We talked about those implications earlier. And so the idea with compensatory storage, typically it happens in the area where the fill is placed on the other side of the river, but we're removing material, we're opening up new floodplain to maintain the ability for water to convey and store on that floodplain. Those functions can be maintained. Compensatory storage is one way of trying to be acknowledging that some new development may occur in floodplains. It's not kind of an all or nothing. However, it's important to note compensatory storage may not be able to be achieved in all places. You might have a very flat floodplain, and any fill in that, maybe it's a very small flat floodplain. You can't make the compensatory storage standards work. Maybe it's an already built out floodplain. There's nowhere to put new floodplain. And so it's not a kind of like a free for all to build, but it also tries to acknowledge maybe in some places there may be some limited development in floodplains. And my last slide here is.
Can I just ask one question about that last slide? And I know you're trying to wrap up, so my apologies. But are parking lots a place that, like, are there any obvious, hey, we could use this as a storage opportunity throughout the state? We've heard a bit about, I think, is it Melrose Place in Brattleboro?
Melrose Terrace, yeah.
Yeah, Melrose Terrace. I mean, are there just places that we should be thinking about that could fit this bill across the board? Like, my immediate thought is just having more impermeable surface with fewer parking lots or taking out some parking lots. But I don't know if that's an obvious one or if there's other places that you have found that just seem to work well.
It's a great question. I will try to be as quick as I can to respect Senator Bray's time limit, but I can always follow up or provide some more thoughts in a different context. There's, again, flooding is a continuum. We have kind of stormwater and the runoff of impervious surfaces that can add to flooding. In our urban areas, they tend to be more inundation, and urban flooding tends to be more stormwater runoff, inability for that system to manage the volume of water. So in some places, a parking lot may add to the potential for flooding. But we also, like, when you get to the FEMA 100-year flood event, like it is so far beyond stormwater runoff, because you're just the volumes of water and like the replenishing of new water from upstream is so great, it's overwhelming any conversations around stormwater. So it's a continuum. Stormwater can lead to more flooding, localized flooding in smaller amounts. But once you're getting up to the big types of floods we're talking about, there's no groundwater storage occurring at that point. That ground is storing whatever it can store, and it's just moving water at that point. So I think floodplains are great places for open space uses. Floodplains in more urbanized and developed areas could be a good place to compromise on a development to put the development out of the floodplain, and maybe there's parking in that flood hazard, in that flood fringe, that flood hazard area. that's at grade, or it could lower the grade to allow it to flood. So you're thinking about like a commercial parking lot, something that's not always used, that could be a great place for a floodplain in a more urbanized, suburbanized area when you're not worried about cars floating away. I mean, that's the risk though.
Yes,
There's that
see
public
there,
safety balance. It's
you're,
like
yes.
you don't want to
Sorry,
have a
you're
bunch of
hitting on the
cars parked
point that I'm
there.
trying to make. Yes, and I don't want to. Yes, thank you. That's.
It's like
I don't want to. I don't want to put you in a position where you're making any cases for any specific strategies, but that's the point I'm trying to make. Um,
it's kind of like if it's residents who live there, all day long, and that's where their cars are parked. I worked in the Waterbury State Office Complex for many years prior to Irene, and every time there was high water, Fish and Wildlife, BGS, Fleet were moving all the cars to the state farm in Duxbury. But it did function as a floodplain, so it's like being aware and of like emergency evacuation operations that you may need to take, steps you need to take to try to be more flood resilient. So it's a continuum, it's an option, it's a tool in the toolbox to use.
Thank you.
Sure. So last slide is, and we've talked about this, I think, to a very great extent, but just to underscore our river corridor no adverse impact standard in those settled village areas, in those downtowns, we're trying not to build closer to the river where development exists. We're trying not to create new channel commitments, but we've already committed to managing the channel in some way. So we're trying not to get people closer to the river, and we're trying to protect them. So maybe that's a place where inundation flood standards may be the bigger consideration in a new project. And then in areas where we still have the ability and opportunity, we're trying to preserve space for that river movement, that dynamic river movement, and avoiding new encroachments that may result in a conflict in the future. And with that, thank you so much for the great conversation, for all of the time, the great questions. And available. I'll be here through Rob's testimony, any additional questions. But I encourage you, again, I mentioned Flood Ready. I spoke about our flood training website, and I hope those are things that you can, that you find helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ms. Pfeiffer. That was a great tutorial. And so it is 10:57, where we have basically an hour left. I'd like to take just a 3-minute break and kick off at 11 with Mr. Evans, and then we'll go from there. Mr. Evans, does an hour, is that enough time for you to get through your materials?
Yeah,
Okay. We can, great.
He's saying.
All right.
I heard him through the wall, and Rob said that an hour is enough for him to
That happens at least once a day. I forget to turn my mic on. The answer is absolutely, I can get through. I probably have 20 to 25 minutes uninterrupted, but I can also accelerate through it, so we'll be good. See you shortly.
Ready to roll?
Mike is on.
Okay, so we are back. And Mr. Evans, thank you for joining us again. You're so back in December. I look forward to your presentation this morning.
All right, so we're ready to go. Thank you, Chair Bray and committee for having me back. Let's make it official for the record. Again, I'm Rob Evans and I manage the Rivers program in ANR DEC Watershed Management Division. Really appreciate the long form conversation. I mean, there's a lot of technical considerations and nuance to the work we do. And so you guys having a foundation as we go into the lawmaking session after all the flooding is really important. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to hear from us. You've heard a lot of technical information from Mike Klein and Rebecca. I'm going to cover similar ground, but in a different way. Hopefully it's complementary and supplementary. Maybe makes you think about things a little bit differently, or certain concepts resonate a little bit more. But some of the material will be, by design, repetitive, but different. Let's see, my slide is not advancing. Oh, very sensitive. So the flow of my talk is going to be as follows. Again, just a quick reminder of the areas regulated. Rebecca touched on those in detail. We're going to do a jurisdiction walkthrough. Again, she hit on the jurisdictions that her program provides a lot of technical assistance to currently, current state of affairs. It's important to understand that. And we'll talk about that in terms of its implications for S213, at least at a high level. And then lastly, she shared towards the end there are no adverse impact standards. I have some very simple kind of visual map examples of how minimum standards are treated for a project versus no adverse impact standards. So hopefully some of that resonates a little bit more. So again, hopefully the term flood hazard areas is starting to sink in. That's defined in statute. It's defined in rule. Those are those inundation flood hazard areas that are mapped by FEMA and regulated by 90% of Vermont towns. And the key standard with flood hazard areas and under the National Flood Insurance Program is that insurable structures, walled roof buildings under the insurance program need to be elevated above that base or 100-year flood elevation. That's to reduce risk. At least historically, that was the basis of rating flood insurance policies. And if you were at flood elevation or elevated higher, your flood insurance premium would be much lower and more affordable. But, as you've heard, and as you know now, elevation standards just don't cut it when this is the nature of your risk. We needed better tools. Mike Klein showed this reach of the Browns River in Underhill on Tuesday. It is a classic textbook example of why the FEMA flood hazard area maps, that's what's shown here, are inadequate tool in and of themselves. Rebecca said in her presentation that, the FEMA maps are 30 to 40 years old for a lot of our communities. And this is really indicative of the river dynamics. FEMA restudied the Browns River, Chittenden County, more broadly, just a little over a decade ago. New hydraulic modeling tied to much more detailed LIDAR topography. And you can just see in that short period of time, the Browns River is already starting to migrate outside of that map flood hazard area. And that's because, as Mike explained, it's in a deepened and steepened condition, and it's trying to re-meander, flatten its slope, and reconnect to floodplain. I don't have it up here, but Mike's slide showed the river corridor like 3 or 4 times as wide, because that's the space the river needs, quite frankly. And another reminder, I think Mike shared this information, through the 2000s, we collected with partners thousands of miles of stream geomorphic assessment data. And the result of those detailed analyses was that 75% of our rivers are in that deepened and steepened condition. Here's just another view of what we've been talking about and what you're considering, which is the fact that the rivers are dynamic in the landscape. And that's what we want. I mean, what you see here over time, over a 30-year period, is this river maintaining its slope as it meanders, deposits and erodes sediment, and part and parcel of that process is maintaining its connection to floodplain. And you asked earlier, Senator Bray, about kind of flood recurrence intervals as it relates to river corridors and fluvial erosion. A river that is well connected to its floodplain should start accessing it during the 1 to 2 year flood. And then, of course, floods greater than that. But that's where it starts to spread out, slow down, you drop its sediment and be less erosive and less destructive. So, you know, again, we're going to talk about a little bit more here. The tool we created to try to keep investments out of these dynamic river bottoms is the river corridor, that meander belt concept. And, you know, when we talk about the river corridor, I mean, it's about keeping, and let's be clear, it's about keeping encroachments out of there, because we know what follows. So that's what this image shows here. It's inevitable that if you place your structure in the river corridor, it's just a matter of time before the river starts its lateral migration towards your investment. And then you're coming to my stream alteration permit program for a permit to rock the banks of the river, to protect those new encroachments from the eroding river. There's always a flood bigger than the rock you put down. I mean, all riprap is temporary in my mind. Some jobs will last longer than others, depending on the size of the rock and the river, but it's all temporary. And what's worse is, you know, that's just bouncing and translating that erosion downstream, undermining bridge abutments, causing additional instability in the system more broadly for other property owners and in the community. We have a lot of channel management commitments around the state. We just don't, as Rebecca said, want to create more of those because it is extremely costly and extremely risky. So this is a bit of a wild card slide here, but I think it's important to talk about riparian area protection or riparian protection areas. I can't remember how it's phrased. That's the new buzzword or term that's being used by partners for buffers, for vegetated buffers. And I think it's important for you to appreciate the distinction. So if somebody says, oh, well, what about riparian area protection? You know, obviously you should start scratching your head at that point and go, well, what is the difference? What is the difference between that and a river corridor? And it really has to do with the fact that when we talk about buffers, riparian area protection, we're talking about vegetation management. And providing a setback from the river. Our agency guidance, depending on river and condition, can be 50 or 100 foot to protect riparian vegetation. That is really different, distinctly different from a setback for encroachments. And if we just kind of look at this graphic a little bit more, where we have the blue line as that kind of more straightened, deepened and steepened river, you can attach a 50-foot riparian buffer to that. If that's your only regulatory mechanism to protect the river, it's not good enough because we know that people will develop up to wherever the regulatory lines are. So you'll end up with encroachments within 50 or 100 feet of the river when it really needs a lot more space for that meandering process. The structures are at risk. The vegetation isn't really going to hold. You know, when you're confining the river with encroachments to within 50 or 100 feet, the stream power will overwhelm trees and wash them downstream, much as we saw all around the state this past summer. And then, of course, the channel management comes in to protect those structures. So now you've confined that river substantially. And so now we have yet another channel of reach. So riparian buffer protection is important. We should do that, but it needs to be within the context of river corridor regulation. I modified this slide because I didn't have time to do like a good map example, but I need to do that because in reality, when you look at our larger rivers and streams, the river corridor is often substantially wider than a buffer setback. So again, we should be managing any riparian vegetation within the context of river corridors. The good news in S213 is it gives us the authority to layer into our existing rule for the larger rivers and streams, those mapped river corridors, some riparian vegetation protection standards. That's something that is truly missing. It's a gap that ought to be filled. When we created our rule after Irene, I'll get to you in a second, Senator McCormick. When we got to our rule after Irene, we were really focused on public safety and hazards and making sure that we were filling that gap with the National Flood Insurance Program because the state was out of compliance with it. But it's something that we should do. Now, just one more thing, and I'll get to you here, is you might ask, well, if we're regulating river corridors and keeping everything out of river corridors, why do we need vegetation standards within river corridors? It's pretty straightforward. We have a lot of existing development within river corridors, and adjacent and on those parcels, there might be well-established riparian vegetation that's helping with water quality, helping with terrestrial and aquatic habitat, holding stream banks. When rivers are well connected to their floodplains, trees are really good at bank stability. Not so much when the river is disconnected from its floodplain. I'll stop there, Senator McCormick. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't mean to interrupt. I kind of put my hand up so for when the time came, but I think that, you know, a row of trees or bushes is certainly better than a pile of boulders. But
Agreed.
essentially, my understanding is that the riparian zone, you know, with the trees, is there for the same reason as the pile of boulders, which is to stop the stream bank from eroding and to basically channel the water downstream. And I understand the problems with that. I buy the argument that you want the river is going to do what it's going to do. We should let it do what it wants to do. And we make our adjustments accordingly. Also, that channeling the waters further downstream just moves the problem to the poor people downstream. But so I guess since a buffer does that as well as riprapping does it, I don't see why it's actually better. It's more pleasant, it's lovelier, but it doesn't. It seems to me its function is essentially the same.
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. If you see these dashed red lines here, you know, that's the edge of the meander belt, you know, when the river gets to its, you know, ideal slope.
Yeah.
But the river corridor, if you go out to the kind of black line here where you see you know, you see this house outside the black line, we add to our meander belt in our river corridor mapping an additional 50 feet. For that vegetated buffer, for those stable boundary conditions, when a river has connection to floodplain and is meandering and expressing itself through its full meander belt, that's where riparian vegetation can effectively hold the banks because the energy is minimized. It's vertically stable. If you are planting trees on a deepened and steepened river, that a lot of times can be wasted money, quite frankly. And we've had conversations with partners where they want to come in with water quality funding to spot arrest erosion, you know, under the guise of you know, water quality. Oh, if we can just arrest erosion here, and we're going to use green techniques, whether it be planting trees or there's this term called a root wrap, which is, you know, root balls from trees instead of rock. Again, at the edge of the meander belt, great. If it's an incised and evolving river, that the stream power will overwhelm that. So just planting trees doesn't stabilize stream banks if the river is not at least near equilibrium. Does that help?
Yeah, let me just make sure I've got it right. So you would not put a riparian zone with plantings right next to that blue stream on your diagram.
Correct. If it's
The
in that,
riparian zone would be out at the far sides of the gray area.
yes, in this area, that's where planting trees, you can actually expect those trees to mature and grow and hold and provide the long-term benefits, not just to bank stability, but again, to water quality and habitat and all of that stuff.
One of the conflicts that I've had to deal with among my constituents are the farmers who, and we, believe it or not, do still have a few farms in Windsor County.
Yes, we do.
Whose fields go right up to the edge of where the water is actually flowing, and so well within the river corridor, and who want to riprap, and they're told no, do a riparian zone instead. And my understanding there is that discussion is about right up on the blue line there.
Yes, and you know, with farmers, it's hard to get funding to just protect your fields with rock. I mean, you know, the NRCS, you know, understands that is, you know, something that is really expensive for the broader federal taxpayer just to be rock armoring banks. And we have a very successful, I highlighted this a month ago, river corridor easement program where when farmers are tired of fighting the river with rock, they can get a landowner payment from us to put that river corridor in an easement. They can still farm their land. They're guests of the river, as we like to say, meaning we have the channel management rights. They don't get to riprap it. And then what attaches to that easement is they have to maintain a 50-foot undisturbed buffer on wherever the stream is as it moves. So as the river moves, that 50-foot line moves. So that modifies their operations, obviously, but you know, we've got 3,000 acres in river corridor easement on 120 parcels, and the demand for river corridor easements is increasing through both water quality funding, through the demand, through the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, et cetera.
Is that done under eminent domain? I mean, this is land that the farmer has dealt with as his land.
Ian has her hand up.
Yeah, the farmers opt into this. They're not forced to do it. It's just, they just opt in when they kind of throw up their hands and go, I can't fight this river anymore. I don't have the money to do it or the wherewithal to do it anymore.
And they're paid? They get
paid, yes, for the easement. Yep.
Okay, Senator Watson.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the things that I have been thinking about is the current use program and how it gives people a better deal on their taxes if they are not developing their land, but putting, you know, using it for agricultural purposes. And that's been expanded, as I understand it, to recently to include things like carbon storage, sequestration, that kind of thing. You know, like you could be managing a woodland for a variety of kinds of purposes. And, you know, so I'm interested in the river corridor easement. I forget what you called the name of this program, the landowner payments to ultimately, you know, create easements on a, you know, agricultural piece of property. But thinking like proactively, like how can we encourage farmers to be actively managing land for flood mitigation? You know, do you see any role for expanding the current use program to have a component that would allow for management of land for flood mitigation?
Good question. Full disclosure, I am not, you know, the best person to talk about the details of current use, but here's what I will offer. There could be significant potential for much larger numbers and tracts of river corridor easement, but I think it's really how do you value that more highly and really increase potentially those landowner payments. I mean, what I said to Chair Sheldon's committee, House Environment and Energy last week, was that, you know, if these flood storage areas, and that's what river corridor connection ultimately is, right? Reconnecting river to floodplain to slow down floodwater. If that's of broader societal benefit to communities and the state of Vermont, hey, farmer, we really need your land to, it's green, it's macro scale green infrastructure for the state and for the community. I think we need to figure out how we can sweeten the pot. I don't know if current use is that place to do that. But you know, it's really about investing in these tracts of land that are under private ownership, and it's a bit. And the reason I say we need to up the landowner payments is, you know, farmers, as everyone knows, are eking out a living at best in many cases, and now we're asking them to take more land out of production. So if we're going to ask them to do that, we need to come to the table seriously. But so again, I think there's others, both in. I have a river corridor easement team lead who is much more versed and has lots of good ideas. We have our lands team in ANR. There are other partners, conservation partners. With our river corridor easement program, we work with the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Vermont River Conservancy, Vermont Land Trust. There is a brain trust out there to I think this through a little further. Not being contemplated in S213, but I think that's an important conversation as you talk about. There's other funding bills, right, that you guys will be considering this session.
Sure. Well, just to add on that, I wonder if it would be of some value to add to 213 some kind of a study committee to sort out like what would, you know, of the options that we have to sweeten the pot, what might be the most effective and welcome and effective.
I'll leave it to you all to decide if that's S213. I know there's a climate infrastructure House bill. You know, I think our climate action office might actually have some thoughts on that as well. But your point's well taken for sure. I think the timing is right for that conversation right now after last year's flooding.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I spent a lot of time. Oh, go ahead, Senator White.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, this is a question for you, coming off of Senator Watson's point. Do we have, how do I phrase this? We've already heard, I mean, I've written down 4 or 5 things from both of these pieces of testimony so far. Senator Watson just hit on my 5th of things that feel relevant that we should consider for S213 or potentially another, as I think Mr. Evans pointed out, maybe another bill that might come our way later. How would you like us to keep track of things that we're seeing as additions? And do we have any way that we could request like a memo or I'm just trying to think. I don't want to lose some of these points because they seem very important. And I want to see them be a part of a legislative conversation too.
Yeah, thanks. You know, when I first brought the bill in the room, I said it's a bus. And there's only like 3 seats occupied.
Yes.
There's room to add more things. And so I just asked every committee member that has an idea as we're noting things. And, you know, as part of our committee work will, I think, be to gather those things together and take more testimony and see how many more seats on the bus we think we can practically fill, and other things might be good ideas for another year, or you know, Senator Watson just alluded to like a study committee. Maybe it's complicated and we can kick off a process that puts us in a better shape for 25 or something like that.
Exactly. Okay, well, I would definitely advocate, thank you, and I would definitely advocate for some of the points we heard today. So it sounds like we'll loop back to this, and I should hold on to any ideas that I have for a future discussion.
Sure, that would be good. I mean, we're in taking off the testimony phase right now, but we'll be shifting to more committee discussion once we have we're better grounded and informed in the subject.
Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on from this slide. In my testimony notes is a link to where this graphic came from if you want a deeper dive. It's our river corridor protection guide that's online. And so there's a link to that that kind of expounds further on, you know, kind of the distinction between buffers and river corridors. But again, the fact that there's in S213, you know, authority for us to layer in riparian vegetation protection standards once at whatever such time we open the hood on our rule, we are happy to add that to our rule. So back to river corridors. You know, again, hopefully as you see these yellow zones that show up on our atlas, you think of the river moving over time in that zone. After Act 138 in 2012, with the need to create our flood hazard area and river corridor rule, layering in river corridor protection in that rule, aligning our municipal model bylaws to regulate river corridors, as well as our work through Act 250, we were directed to provide river corridor maps from Act 138, but we decided that, you know, kind of town by town, but we decided that was, which was what we had been doing prior to Irene, where we had data, but we endeavored to create a statewide river corridor map. And so this is again available on our Natural Resources Atlas, publicly available. 14,000 miles of river and stream are covered. Looking at it a little closer, this is what it looks like if you pull it up on our Natural Resources Atlas. Again, another kind of, let's talk specifically about what S213 is contemplating. It's not 14,000 plus miles of river corridor. It is a kind of an initial kind of bite at the apple, focus on those larger rivers and streams. These mapped polygons that drain greater than 2 square miles. They're defined as mapped in the proposed legislation as mapped river corridors. And that's the distinction there is between that and these small streams. So these are streams that are draining between 1/4 and 2 square miles, much smaller streams. And that's not a mapped polygon, that's just a line feature that says what the river corridor is on these small streams that are less than 2 square miles. It's a 50-foot setback from the top of the river channel or stream channel. And you'd say, well, why? You just told us that buffers aren't good enough. And so now the river corridor seems to align with the buffer setback. Well, there's a couple of reasons for why we decided that that would be an adequate river corridor for small streams. First of all, mapping efficiency. With new rule coming online and the need for a statewide layer to inform siting and development review, et cetera, to do mapped polygons for these small streams probably would have taken us another 3 years. And so there's that. But we really looked at our data, watershed size, our data regarding stream channels, reference stream channels, and convinced ourselves that the 50-foot setback for these smaller streams is more than adequate, not just for riparian buffer protection, but also for those flood-related processes. These are steeper channels typically. They're more sediment production and transport reaches. They don't usually need the meander space of our lower gradient alluvial valleys. And S213 doesn't touch those 8,600 miles of small stream. It's just those larger rivers and streams. So I think that's good in that regard, that it's because it's a whole nother conversation that we don't have time for today if we're going to talk about the small streams as well. Understanding that there's damages can be on small streams, but that's not to dismiss the importance of small streams. They are equally as important. But anyway, again, S213 is looking at those larger mapped river corridors. And then just to kind of visualize, what S213 is proposing to fill a gap with river corridor regulation. And hopefully this slide kind of crystallizes that a little bit for you. We have, as Rebecca alluded to or said, we have 29 towns that have adopted town-wide regulation. And that's for both the small streams and the mapped river corridors. If the image on the right, you kind of see the red is that kind of larger, lower gradient river corridors. The green streams are those smaller drainage, river corridor setback areas. So you have towns like Corinth that have those townwide bylaws, but look at all the surrounding towns. Look at all those blue lines that don't have town regulation of any sort in terms of river corridors. The only regulation, river corridor regulation, that attaches is under those limited state authorities that I'll touch on here in a minute, which is Act 250 if it's triggered, or if it's one of those limited activities currently regulated under our rule. And then just to put a little bit finer point on it, you know, thinking again about kind of the piecemeal development that could happen up and down river corridors. You know, these smaller residential developments are sub-jurisdictional under Act 250. And if the town isn't regulating it and Act 250 isn't regulating it, and of course, if it's not, you know, a state-owned building or facility, then it's there's no regulation precluding it from being built in a dangerous area. So 9% of perennial stream miles regulated by those 29 towns. That's not very many, right? S213 dials that up to about 40% of stream miles. So it definitely starts to fill that gap, to be sure. Senator McCormick?
Yeah, just an observation. There is an effort afoot in the legislature this year to increase the amount of development that is sub-jurisdictional. I just thought of that.
Yes, and the
That
closing.
not protecting our resources is being touted as a good thing. We should be aware of that.
Hold that thought. I'm going to get to that towards the end of my slide deck here. And it's related to S213 as well. So again, presented by Rebecca, this is just in a similar but kind of different format. But again, the patchwork of regulatory jurisdiction. Land use is still largely regulated at the municipal level. Act 250, and then under our rule. I'm going to touch on each of these quickly. And so again, you know, this is the map that Rebecca shared, and those green towns all enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program. S213 has us essentially taking over the regulation of flood hazard areas from towns. That is significant. Tremendous resource needs to make that happen. I mean, on paper, you have, you know, somewhere between probably 250 and 260 staff people at the town level statewide that are tasked with administering their local flood hazard regulations. To then stop that and ask the state to do it fairly abruptly is a non-starter as drafted in the bill. We understand the challenges. We think there's opportunities this session to consider other options in the nearer term. Details I can't really go into greatly today. But you know, it's a big deal. You know, the S213 has the option for towns to opt in, or maybe I can't remember how it's structured, but basically raise our hand to say we want to keep jurisdiction of our flood hazard areas. I think, if hazarding a guess, you'd have less than a dozen towns raising their hand to do that. So anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about this in my closing remarks. But anyway, that proposal in S213 was basically shocking to us. Senator Watson.
Yeah, thank you. I can appreciate that. That seems like a fair concern and objection. How much staff do you think it would take for you to do this? Like, if we're going to build into this, like, okay, you need more staff. How many people would you need?
This is just off the top of my brain. So, you know, take it as that. It could be 15 to 20 more people just in Rebecca Pfeiffer's team. She has 5 regional floodplain managers, actually less because she has to spend her time with other duties as the NFIP coordinator with FEMA funding that she receives. Here's an example. Just after the flooding this summer, her team, Rebecca's team, was providing substantial damage technical assistance to towns. That's a detailed post-flood permitting thing they must do as an NFIP minimum. just her team, just providing that technical assistance to towns was overwhelmed. We had to pull in experts from Florida to help us. And that work still isn't done. And it's not just permitting staff, it's administrative staff, it's enforcement staff, it's legal staff, because we need to enforce the regulations. So it's a big number. Again, I threw that out there. It could be a little less, it could be more. I mean, quite frankly, if we were to take it over as contemplated in S213. Now, and again, I guess I'll just reiterate, I'll state and reiterate later my closing remarks. I think that there are things that we can do in the nearer term. Talking about the state taking over some or all is a conversation, but that's a much longer term deliberative conversation in terms of what it looks like.
Right. I'll jump in.
Thank you.
The bill contemplates, sort of a longer term vision folded into a bill that says we're doing this all now. And part of the point of taking the testimony is to find out how practicable it is. And then just for, Mr. Evans and Ms. Pfeiffer, we are gonna ask the secretary to come in and stuff. And so I don't necessarily want you to be in the awkward spot of having to field staffing questions in terms of budgets and stuff like that, as while we're focused today on a more technical presentation. So it's great that you're sharing. I'm not trying to discourage that. I just also want you to feel like, oh, we're not asking you to budget this out for us, because we will get to that, but we're gonna request that information next week.
I appreciate that, Senator Bray. Thank you. Any other questions before I move on? I want to keep rolling, just looking at the clock here.
Thank you, Chair Bray. My question, based on your response just now, should be saved for the commissioner or secretary.
I couldn't help myself in at least throwing out a number out there. I think the number is big, I think is what you needed to hear. If we were to just flip over to taking this over from towns. And there are other complexities related to our funding that we receive from FEMA, where we monitor community compliance, kind of in a quasi-enforcement role. If we're the ones doing it, that changes our whole dynamic and funding structure potentially with FEMA. So that's a conversation with FEMA too. So again, this is a longer term prospect as considered right now. I think but I'm not saying it shouldn't be a conversation that needs to continue. Okay, moving on. Again, Act 250. We provide regulatory recommendations to district commissions. Mr. Klein, said that our authority to determine what's jurisdictional in river corridors and flood hazard areas is affirmed 3 times by the Supreme Court. So that's good, that's solid, but it's awkward because we don't issue the permits. We issue regulatory recommendations consistent with our no adverse impact standards in a signed DEC procedure. But because of that structure, we are constantly being challenged by developers and their consultants. It really draws out the Act 250 process substantially. And it's frustrating for us. We put a lot of time into it. It's frustrating for the project proponents as well. So, Act 250, I think there may be some nearer term opportunity there as well, because I know that's being considered in different ways this session. Moving along, Rebecca, just to repeat, she said we have our state rule, which is S213 is explicitly talking about, required after Act 138. It regulates those activities towns can't, and again makes flood hazard areas statewide and 5,600 miles or 40% of river corridors regulatory. I guess at this point, this is where I'd like to share some simple examples, just to hopefully maybe put a little bit finer point on some of the content that's been shared with you previously about what's the difference when you're thinking about, and again, simple examples, but when you're thinking about minimum standards like FEMA minimum standards versus the no adverse impact standards we have in rule and what we recommend to towns. what does that look like kind of on the ground or on a map more particularly? So I'm going to walk through a few examples here. So here's a situation where somebody proposes to build a house. That green hatched area is the FEMA floodway. No fill, no build, unless you can do really expensive modeling and analysis. Minimum standards, as Rebecca said, allow you to develop and fill right up to that floodway boundary. So significantly confine the river. And so as Senator McCormick said, you're in effect, if you do that, requiring a lot of channelization then, if you do that full encroachment, as the minimum standards allow you to do. And again, that full encroachment on the floodway understandably raises flood elevations, and the floodway has considered that. The minimum standard again for elevation is that low floor, as I showed you in a slide earlier, being elevated at least to that base flood or 100-year flood elevation. There are other standards that we don't want to get into the weeds to, because there's a lot of other standards that attach, that have to do with, using flood resistant materials and elevating and flood proofing, building utilities, et cetera. So now if we look at the same situation under the no adverse impact, well, one more slide here, I guess, to really look at some of the problems now with that. Okay, you can just elevate to the base flood elevation, and as long as you're outside the floodway, you're good. But even if the minimum standards are met, structures within the river corridor are still at a heightened risk of flood-related erosion. I've added the river corridor layer here, so you can see that once you add that important layer on, it's like, oh, wait, but why would we want to put a house in that area? That's where the river's dynamic. If you look at my highlighter here, you can actually see, again, the river is outside of the FEMA floodway. The FEMA floodway, by definition, should contain the river channel. It doesn't even contain the river channel. And it's moving around. And so that's the minimum standards allow river corridor encroachment. And again, there's a new channel management commitment to rock the bank of the river going forward, because that river is going to continue to adjust. And again, that's not necessarily a guarantee that that house is protected, and it's also bouncing that erosion energy downstream into other properties and infrastructure. That's an adverse impact from the minimum standards.
Mr. Evans, question. When you said there is now a new channel management commitment made by whom to whom?
Great question, and I'm glad you asked. We don't condemn existing uses. And what I mean by that is if this hypothetical house was built and the river continued its march towards it, because these people wanted to be close to the river because they could hear the babbling brook when the water's low. If they want to rock the banks of the river to protect their structure, they need a permit from my stream alteration program. We allow people to protect their investments. And so that's why we don't want new investments to go in, because once they're in there, people will want to protect them. And we allow people to protect their investments, just like we're protecting downtown Montpelier with, a concrete wall and a stacked wall. And so a human investment of value in our mind is a channel management commitment. Somebody's going to want to protect it because they paid money to put it there and they don't want to lose it.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Rebecca talked about compensatory storage. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But, when you're elevating on fill, if the structure is elevated on fill, which is the cheapest way to elevate residential structures, is to bring in a lot of earthen material and build a house on top of that. You're reducing beneficial floodplain function. You're reducing flood storage capacity. You're reducing flood conveyance capacity. That can increase flood elevations and velocities, again, for people nearby, and exacerbating flood hazards. Adverse impacts by the minimum standards allowing you to fill. And, this won't surprise anybody. Elevating to the base flood elevation is better than not. You're reducing risk there, but in our changing climate with bigger and bigger floods, today's base flood elevation or 100-year flood elevation, going forward might be the 10-year flood elevation. So larger floods are going to get you. The tropical storm Irene was 2 feet higher than the base flood elevation in Waterbury, for example. So just meeting that minimum elevation standard can have its own adverse impacts, even if you think you've mitigated. All right, let's now flip to what no adverse impact looks like. You'll see that the structure is further away. We'll go back. Structure is further away because the no adverse impact framework requires that you be outside the FEMA floodway and the river corridor. That by necessity puts you further away from the river, and that reduces risk right there. Not only are you not in that dynamic area, as Rebecca said earlier, flood waters are generally towards the edge of the floodplain shallower and less deep, and the velocities are slower, so that's a good thing, and you're providing that space for the meander process. Our standards require elevation of the lowest floor 2 feet above the base flood elevation. Rebecca's highlighted that. Don't need to go into that more, but again, that builds additional mitigation into the structure to account for those larger floods we're seeing. Towns can adopt higher, that's called freeboard, 2 feet of freeboard, kind of tied to kind of dams and dam regulation and management and design. There's towns like, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there's towns like, I think it's Grand Isle. I think they have a 5-foot requirement because of the lake flooding in 2011 and the wave action associated with that. They require low floors for new structures to be 5 feet above, but 2 feet is where we are at the state level currently. And then again, Rebecca provided that cross section showing that if you're going to elevate on fill, you need to provide compensatory storage. You need to offset the impacts of that fill to maintain the space for flood storage and conveyance. Sometimes, depending on your parcel, that's the stopper because you don't have the space to do it because there might be adjacent investments, properties, infrastructure, and you can't provide that compensatory storage. So sometimes that can be a showstopper, or require additional modeling because it's a volumetric analysis to show that fill is not going to increase elevations or velocities. Okay, now we're going to flip. I'm about done here, so I think time-wise we're in pretty good shape. Senator Bray, I just have a couple more slides. So let's flip to the developed area context. I meant to put a star on top of the Golden Dome, but that should look familiar to you. That's downtown Montpelier. The Golden Dome isn't gold because of the black and white, but here Senator Bray is sitting right now. So what about no adverse impact standards in developed areas? Essentially the same as I just went through in undeveloped areas, the standards that I have on the screen there. But what is really different, and this shouldn't surprise you now because you've heard from Mike and Rebecca on this idea, but what about the river corridor? So just to clean the map up, let's go to the next slide. If you were proposing, that's blank parking lot where that hypothetical new structure is, if somebody wanted to put a new structure there, it is in the mapped river corridor. But our no adverse impact standards allow for infill and redevelopment in densely developed areas, designated centers, existing settlements. Again, because we are managing that river heavily already. So the key standard is that new development in these designated areas can go in the river corridor, but not be any closer to the river than pre-existing development. Don't encroach further. In this context, again, the river is and will continue to be heavily channelized. The question Senator Bray asked, channel management commitments. An infill structure in the river corridor in downtown Montpelier does not add a new channel management commitment. We are already committed to locking the river in because of the tremendous investment. The key thing is floodproofing, flood inundation criteria, elevation floodproofing to really make those buildings withstand that type of flooding. That's the type of flooding we saw, was that inundation flooding did all that damage. Yes, there was some erosion around the bank armoring. Our buildings and general services had to do some temporary stabilization. They also have longer term project they're contemplating there. So it's not to say that those erosional processes still aren't working there, but again, new development in this area is not making the erosion problem worse, because you really can't make it worse. So I guess the pivot here is to what S13 has in it regarding the mapping of infill polygons. What is an infill polygon, you ask? Well, it's really, it really came to be, it's a conceptual thing and nothing more. We did some internal mapping in, with our colleagues, Chris Cochran's shop at ACCD a number of years back. And the idea with the infill polygon is recognizing what I just spoke about, is like, do we really need to care about river corridors? And there's a lot of kind of misinformation and misunderstanding, thinking that river corridors are going to preclude development in them in these highly developed areas. That's just simply not the case. So, this is just kind of, again, it's good that S213 has that in there. The green area basically, and this is just a kind of a rough cut. There was no technical process. I just did this as a hypothetical, just to be clear. Process needs to be developed to establish these. But the green area on this hypothetical infill polygon basically signals that, hey, in this context, we don't apply river corridor regulations. It's kind of a go zone for the river corridor standards, so we can just focus on those inundation standards and mitigating risk related to flood inundation. Again, river's already heavily channelized, and the additional development does not exacerbate erosion. And again, this is kind of going back and tying into that infographic that Rebecca shared about river corridors upstream versus downtown areas, and where we're going to concentrate development versus protect open spaces. Infill polygons is kind of within that framing, which is, again, this is where we're going to concentrate development, make sure we harden it. But river corridor regulations don't get in the way of that, because the real prize is looking up and downstream. And this is my last slide before closing remarks. This is upstream town line of East Montpelier and Plainfield, largely undeveloped river corridor. That's the prize we're seeking ultimately when we talk about protecting river corridor, because we don't want to add new encroachments there. You can see in some areas the river is meandering quite a bit, probably has good connection. We want to keep that. You can also see other reaches that are fairly straight, where there's opportunity for the river to meander and reestablish a flatter slope there, perhaps more flood storage capacity over time if we can keep development out of those areas. So that's my last slide, and I have some closing remarks on S213. If you'll bear with me there, and then I can take any final questions. Almost right on time, all worked out. Sometimes you don't know if the timing's going to work out.
Well, thank you. And since we're remote, it's a little less pressing that we hit the 12 o'clock whistle.
Fair enough. Still want to be respectful of everybody's time, since we've been going since 9 a.m. Appreciate your sticking with us. So I guess, I'll say that I won't be able to provide some of the detail you're seeking today on S213 in terms of, explicit recommendations. Hopefully what follows here is a setting of the table for more detailed conversations and recommendations with the agency and other partners. There's 4 key elements I'm just going to touch on, some of which I've touched on through my testimony already, but I just want to kind of button it up if I can. S213 proposes to have ANR regulate FEMA map flood hazard areas statewide. The scale of agency permitting and floodplain development through the National Flood Insurance Program is simply unworkable as drafted. Given our role providing local permitting technical assistance, we are keenly aware of the challenges for small towns to administer this complex permitting program. While flipping some or all of this to the state can be considered as a longer-term action, as mentioned before, should not be done hastily at this time. We're working on a set of minimum floodplain standards to work in concert with the FEMA map update process underway. We think that might be something that we could talk to you in more detail about in the coming weeks and with other folks. The second element is expansion of river corridor regulation. through the rule as recommended in the Climate Action Plan and supported by the agency. Secretary Moore was on the Climate Council. We understand the gap in that regulation protection. The expansion of jurisdiction, as I mentioned, takes a measured approach by focusing on those 40% of river corridors that are the mapped river corridors for larger rivers and streams. Further discussion is needed, though, on elongating the implementation timeline, as there are important steps and resources that need to be considered and discussed before implementation. The proposal, as I mentioned, to add the vegetation management standards in the rule are supported. Again, first iteration of the rule doesn't have that. It is a gap. It would be important to add that. I think the only thing that I didn't say earlier is right now at the state level, buffers are only regulated through Act 250. So Act 250 jurisdictional projects are partners in Fish and Wildlife. We provide the comments and recommendations under criterion 1D, and they provide the buffer recommendations under criterion 1E streams, but in similar fashion, their recommendations. So our rule is a good first place to start with more official protection of riparian vegetation, and doing it within the context of river corridor regulation is a good thing. So happy to do that at such time we open up the hood on the rule. And then the fourth and final element here is that, what I closed with, the river corridor infill mapping requirement is supported. This is one of those key elements that needs to be done before any jurisdictional expansion because it'll take time. Frankly, river corridor infill polygons would create efficiencies for our existing work. Right now, it'd be helpful. Helpful for people doing planning work in towns as well to have that information. River corridor infill areas for more densely developed existing settlements and designated centers will aid tremendously in planning and regulatory administration. But again, will take time to complete. We'll need resources. Will need to be done in partnership with municipalities and RPCs at the minimum, and perhaps others. Thinking of some of the environmental groups out there, like the Nature Conservancy and VNRC. So we're not prepared to discuss, as I said, in detail 213 proposal today, but we believe there are options in the near term that we should discuss and are currently under consideration by agency leadership, sister programs, and sister agencies. And I'll stop there for any final questions or thoughts.
Okay, well, you've been like a prize. The second hand is only 5 seconds away from 12 on the wall here. So
nice.
The
pure luck.
Well, so thank you very much, Ms. Pfeiffer Bolt, for like a great tutorial this morning. I know that I feel like we're now in second. We were first kindergarten a week ago, first grade 2 days ago. Now we're up to second, and we have a ways to go. But thanks so much for helping us learn more, and look forward to learning more in coming week. Again, the secretary and commissioner are being invited in, so I'm guessing that's when we'll get into more along the lines of talking about budgeting and staffing implications and phasing. I think regardless of how much money and staff were available, every project has a reasonable and less reasonable timelines in order to try to do the work well and not have it become a problem for people. I mean, it just takes time to engage, as you were saying, the municipalities, the RPCs, the various advocacy groups. There's a widespread shared interest, so we're aware of that. At the same time, I don't fault the bill at all for being ambitious, so we'll stick with that as well. A quick question. I see Ms. Smith is on the call, and it was just sort of a big picture question. When we start saying you can't develop in an area because it's going to have negative consequences, do we ever end up being accused of a taking, and do we end up with land issues and then legal issues? How does that get sorted out?
I think in this context, and for the record, my name is Hannah Smith. I'm an attorney with the Department of Environmental Conservation. The term taking is often thrown at the state. In this case, it would be a regulatory taking. The argument being that somehow the agency's regulation results in somebody's private property being unusable. I don't know of any instances at all where that claim has been validated against the agency in the context of the River Corridor Program. I could look into that further, but I'm, at least in my time here, I'm not aware of that happening.
Okay.
I have some additional info to add, and I think Rebecca's ready to jump in too, because she can say more than I can. It really speaks to why we framed our standards that we do have under the heading of no adverse impact. That's a regulatory construct that the Association of State Floodplain Managers developed for states and communities to employ decades ago. And as part of that, they did a significant roll-up on the takings question nationwide and found that when it comes to hazards, you know, you could almost flip the coin to say, if you're increasing hazards on other people's property, you're taking their property rights. So it's about protecting the property rights of others. And so we do get the takings question quite a bit. And no adverse impact has a firm legal underpinning. There's a big document with a case law roll-up that we could send you if you're interested. But like Hannah said, I'm not aware in the state of anybody like taking that case all the way to environmental court or the Supreme Court, at least not under my tenure, 16 years of tenure in the program. So
yeah, one of the things I was going to add to that is in 2009, our previous program manager, Barry Kuhn, Mike Klein, had worked with the Vermont Law School on a symposium. And part of that symposium, at the time, a VLS law student who is now very active and well known in the floodplain management realm nationwide, Sam Medlock, had done a case review of Vermont. I mean, it's 2009, so it's a little bit dated, but she had done a case review and had found that there's that consistent upholding of the existing development rights. And I think water law has shown that typically it's like new development impacting existing development has usually been upheld and supported in case law.
Well, great. I mean, that's a encouraging thing to hear. Senator McCormick, I think last word goes to you. Your mic is off.
Sorry, you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the interest of time, I won't ask for an answer now, but perhaps follow up if there's any follow up from the witnesses. And for this committee going forward, I think we do need to constantly re-examine the proposition that we hear regularly in the State House that environmental protection is to blame for our housing difficulties. And I would like to, whenever we talk about environmental protection, I would like to include in that discussion whether or not it's true that our environmental protection results in less housing, as opposed to the cost of materials, the cost of labor, other market forces. That this is actually a function of environmental protection.
Okay, right. Great. So thank you everyone again, and we'll be back tomorrow with ANR to look at wetlands and dam provisions in the bill.